Welcome to Darkverse. I'm Isaac Nightshade, your guide through the eerie, the unknown, and the stories that linger in the shadows. Now, I'm not your average storyteller. I've spent 69 years weaving words, creating worlds, and sharing the stories that haunt my mind. But now, with the weight of my years and the stories still left to tell, I've come here to share them with you. Writing has been my life, my craft, my passion, my escape. But now it's time to let the world in on what's been waiting in the dark corners of my imagination. So if you're intrigued by the stories I'm about to share, if you find comfort in the chill of the unknown, consider subscribing. Support an old writer, someone who spent his years in ink and silence. Your support means more than you know. Join me. Let's explore the Darkverse together. Tonight, you're about to hear 28 tales that will chill your bones and linger in your mind long after the final word. These stories you won't forget, and if you like, please, subscribe to my channel. Let's begin. Story 1, The Signal from Nowhere. I never believed in anything beyond what I could see with my own eyes. That's what made it so hard for me to admit what happened that night. It wasn't a prank, and it wasn't a glitch. There was something far worse at play. Something I could never have prepared myself for. I worked the overnight shift at a small radio station called KMRD 106.6 FM. It wasn't much, a tiny building tucked between two dilapidated warehouses on the edge of town, mostly ignored by the world. But I loved it. No one to bother me, just the low hum of equipment and the occasional listener. Most of our audience was made up of late-night truckers or people like me who couldn't sleep. I'd been with the station for about 6 months, filling in during the quiet hours from midnight to 4 a.m. It was a simple gig. I played old vinyl records, read weird news from around the world, and got paid just enough to scrape by. The studio was always empty, save for the occasional stray cat that wandered in through the broken door. That night, though, everything changed. At 1:36 a.m., the phone rang. The flashing light on the control panel was a regular occurrence, especially with the few late-night callers we got. Most of them were drunks or pranksters looking for attention. But tonight I was alone. The station was quiet. I answered, trying to mask the monotony in my voice. KMRD, you're on air. This is Lana. There was no response at first. I waited, adjusting. The microphone tapping my fingers on the desk, expecting the usual nonsense. Then finally a voice. It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. You have to stop them. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I leaned closer to the receiver. Who? I asked, my voice almost breaking the silence. Who do I need to stop? The line crackled, like static dancing across the speakers. Then the whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. They are already inside. I glanced at the control panel in confusion. The phone line had gone dead. I stared at it, unnerved, but only for a moment. It could have been a prank, a wrong number, or maybe some kind of feedback on the line. I had no time to dwell on it. The show had to go on. I sat back, adjusting my headphones and shaking off the unease that had settled in my chest. I queued up a segment, but just as I was about to hit play, I heard something else. It wasn't in the headset, not in the recording. It was coming from the room. A low, rhythmic humming. I froze. It wasn't just static. It sounded almost alive. The air felt thick, dense, like I was suddenly surrounded by something I couldn't see. I spun around in my chair, my heart hammering in my chest, expecting to see someone standing behind me, maybe another late-night visitor. But the studio was empty. I quickly switched off the music and scanned the monitors in front of me. Everything seemed normal. The lines, the station's frequency. But then I noticed something strange. The tuning dial. It was moving on its own. I couldn't believe it. The knob turned, slow and deliberate, as though someone invisible was adjusting it. I reached out to stop it, but just before my fingers touched the dial, it snapped back to its original position. The hum in the air intensified, reverberating in my skull, until it felt like it was coming from within me. I shoved the headset off my head, breathing heavily. The studio lights flickered once, then twice. I should have left. I should have run the hell out of there. But instead, I just sat there, frozen. Then through the speakers, came the voice again. But this time, it wasn't the faint whisper I had heard before. It was clear, and it wasn't a human voice. It sounded like something else. Something not meant for this world. "Welcome back," it said. The words stretched like they were being dragged through thick tar. "We've been waiting. You'll bring them through the airwaves." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stood, heart pounding in my chest, and backed away from the console. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. I could feel the walls of the studio pressing in, the air thick with dread. My breath was shallow, and I didn't know if I was about to pass out or if I was about to scream. Before I could reach for the door, the humming grew louder. The lights flickered violently, and the air turned colder, like a blast of icy wind had been pumped into the room. The windows vibrated, rattling against their frames as if something was trying to force its way in. I could almost hear something scratching at the glass. I grabbed my coat and rushed toward the exit, not even caring to check the equipment anymore. I just needed to get out. But as I stepped into the hallway, something stopped me. A feeling that I was being watched. Every step I took, I felt it getting closer. And then the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my heart in my throat, and saw nothing but the flickering lights in the hallway. And then the voice came again. Right behind me this time, too close to ignore. "You're not leaving. You never leave." I turned, and there, standing at the end of the hallway, was a figure. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It was more like a shadow, an outline of something that shouldn't be standing there. But the thing that terrified me the most were the eyes. A pair of hollow black sockets staring straight at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Suddenly, everything went dark. When the morning crew arrived, they found the station abandoned. There was no sign of me. The equipment was still running, but the air in the building felt wrong. A hum lingered in the walls, a sound that no one could quite place. The radio station was shut down. The building was boarded up. But the strange thing was that the frequency was still active. Every year at 1:36 a.m., KMRD's signal returns. If you tune in, you'll hear a voice. Always the same, always clear. They are already inside. And if you're unlucky enough, you might hear something more. A whisper. Welcome back. Story 2. The Silent Guest. I was only 9 years old when I first saw it. I didn't understand what it was at the time, but looking back now, I know exactly what it was and what it meant. I had just moved with my parents to an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't even on a proper street, just a long, overgrown dirt road leading to a patch of land surrounded by woods. The house itself was massive, built in the late 1800s. My parents thought it was perfect, full of charm and character. I thought it was creepy, with its long hallways, creaking floors, and windows that never seemed to open quite right. We had been living there for a few weeks when I first noticed it. I remember it was late in the evening. My parents were downstairs watching TV, and I had gone up to my room to read. The door to my room creaked open slowly, but I assumed it was just the house settling. But when I turned around, there it was, a figure standing in the doorway. At first, I thought it was my mom, but as my eyes focused, I realized that this wasn't her. It was a woman, or at least, I think it was a woman. She stood still, her figure dark and indistinct, like a shadow made of smoke. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched me with those empty eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Her clothes were strange, tattered, almost like an old dress from a time long gone. I froze, my heart pounding. I could feel the fear creeping up from my stomach into my chest, but I couldn't look away. For a few moments, it was like time had stopped. Then slowly, she began to move, not toward me, but toward the back of my room. And as she moved, the air around her seemed to grow colder, like a breeze that couldn't be explained. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, watching as she walked toward the far corner of the room, where the old rocking chair sat. The chair creaked, slightly as she passed it, and then she was gone. I ran downstairs as fast as I could, not even bothering to explain what had just happened. My parents didn't believe me. They told me it was just my imagination, or maybe I had dreamed it. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. And then it kept happening. Every night, for weeks, she would appear. Sometimes she would be standing in the doorway. Sometimes she would be sitting in the corner, just watching me. But always she was silent. And no matter how much I begged or how loud I screamed, she wouldn't speak. She wouldn't move until she vanished into the shadows. By the time I was 10, I was beyond terrified. I had started sleeping with the lights on, leaving the door open, and even trying to sleep with my parents. But the woman, or whatever it was, didn't care. She was always there, always watching. One night my parents had to go out. It was just me alone in the house. I don't remember what time it was, but it was dark and the house was eerily quiet. I was sitting in my room trying to distract myself with a book when I heard the familiar sound of the floor creaking, like someone was walking down the hallway. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see her again, but I had to. And when I did, I saw it. She was standing at the foot of my bed. This time I couldn't hold it in. I screamed, but the scream caught in my throat, as if something was pressing down on me. And that's when it happened. Something that has haunted me ever since. She moved closer, but as she did, her shape began to change. She wasn't the same shadowy figure anymore. Her features came into focus, and I could see her face, pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow pits of blackness. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was like she was trying to speak, but couldn't. I could feel the air growing thick, like the walls were closing in on me. And then, for the first time, I heard her, but not with my ears. She whispered inside my head, "I've been waiting for you." I felt the words reverberate through my mind, cold and heavy. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually she just disappeared, vanished without a trace. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I spent the hours staring into the corner of my room, watching for any sign of movement, any hint that she might return, but she didn't. The next morning I told my parents everything. I told them about the figure, the whispers, the way she always watched me, but they still didn't believe me. They said I was imagining things. Maybe it was just a bad dream, but I knew better. I knew that she was real. Weeks passed, and eventually things started to quiet down. I hadn't seen her in days. But then, one evening, my parents went out again, and I was left alone in the house. That night, I felt it again. The weight in the air, the cold that seemed to seep into the room. I couldn't ignore it this time. I couldn't pretend that I hadn't been waiting for it. The silence was broken by a soft rustling from the corner of my room. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. But I could feel her presence, as if she was standing right behind me, watching. And then I heard it again. The whisper, just like before, echoing inside my mind. "It's time." I turned, too afraid to move, but somehow knowing I had to. And there she was, standing in the doorway once again. Her face was now clearer, her features sharp and terrifying. And this time she wasn't alone. There were others, shadows shifting in and out of the darkness, their forms barely visible, like they were waiting for something. For me, I don't know what happened after that. I don't know how I ended up outside in the woods behind the house. I don't know why I didn't scream for help, but I remember the moment I reached the trees, the moment I felt free. I never returned to that house. To this day, I can still hear the whispers sometimes, like a distant echo in the back of my mind. And I know, somehow, that the woman in the doorway, the silent guest who watched me all those years ago, is still waiting. Somewhere. Waiting for me to return. Because I never should have left. Story 3. The Child in the Mirror. It started with the reflection. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghost stories or supernatural tales. I was the sort of person who chalked up strange happenings to imagination or coincidence. But what happened that night? I can't explain it. I don't know if I ever will. It was a few years ago, right after I moved into my first apartment. The place was small but cozy, perfect for me. The rent was cheap, and I didn't mind the peeling wallpaper and the creaky floors. The only thing that made me uneasy was the mirror. It was one of those antique-style mirrors with an ornate wooden frame, and it hung in the hallway between the kitchen and the bathroom. I didn't pay much attention to it when I first moved in. It was just a mirror. But over time, I started noticing things. Little things at first, like the way my reflection seemed off. It wasn't that the reflection was distorted or anything like that. No, it was more like the reflection didn't move at the same pace as I did. I'd be walking past the mirror, and my reflection would lag behind, just a second or two slower. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the lighting, or the angle, or some weird quirk of the mirror. But it kept happening. One night, I came home from work a little late. I had to use the bathroom, so I walked down the hallway, past the mirror. As usual, I glanced at it without thinking. But this time, something caught my eye. A figure. It wasn't me. It was a child. A small, pale child with wide, unblinking eyes. They were standing in the mirror just behind me. I froze, my blood turning cold. My reflection was standing perfectly still, staring into the mirror. But the child wasn't my reflection. It was like it was behind me, watching. I jerked my head around, expecting to see a kid standing there. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. I took a few steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and glanced back at the mirror. The child was still there, but this time they were closer. I could see their face now, pale and gaunt. Their lips were cracked, like they hadn't spoken in years. I could feel a sense of dread wash over me as I stared at them, frozen in place. The child slowly raised one hand, pointing directly at me. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move. Eventually, I ran into the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and didn't come out for hours. I was terrified. The next day, I convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. Maybe my tired mind had played a prank on me, or I had imagined it. But I couldn't shake the image of that child's face from my mind. The way they had looked at me, like they were trying to tell me something important. Over the next few days, the events started to escalate. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was everywhere. At night, I would hear faint footsteps behind me, echoing through the apartment, the soft sound of small shoes tapping against the floor. I would turn around, expecting to see someone there, but there was never anyone. Just the same empty hallway, the same empty rooms, and the whispers. Soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, that maybe I was imagining it out of sheer exhaustion. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to surround me. Finally, I decided I had to do something about the mirror. It felt like the source of all the strange things happening in my apartment. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something wasn't right with it. I went out the next day and bought a sheet to cover it, hoping that would stop whatever was happening. That night, I felt a little relief. It was the first night in weeks that I didn't feel the presence of the child watching me. The footsteps were quieter, the whispers softer. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard it again. A soft rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's giggle. The sound was coming from the hallway. I sat up, my heart racing, and looked toward the door. The giggle echoed again, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. This time, they were moving toward my bedroom. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed the number for a friend. I didn't know what to do. I needed help. But before the phone could even ring, the giggle stopped. There was a long pause, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft tap, tap, tap on the door. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The tapping continued, rhythmic and slow, like the child was counting the seconds between each tap. Then the voice, quiet, almost drowned, by the sound of my own heartbeat. "Let me in." I jumped back, the phone slipping from my hand, and I bolted out of bed, rushing to the door. I checked the locks, double-checked the windows. Everything was secure, but the voice, the whisper, kept coming, soft, persistent. "Let me in." I pulled the sheet off the mirror. The child was standing there again, in the reflection. But this time they weren't alone. Behind the child was a tall figure, shrouded in shadow with eyes that seemed to burn. Through the glass, it was watching me, and I could feel its presence growing stronger, pressing in on me. The child, now grinning, turned their head slowly to look at me, as though inviting me to step closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The whispering, the tapping, everything. It felt like the mirror was calling me. The figure in the reflection didn't blink. It just stared. And the child standing next to it reached out and touched the glass. It's been 2 weeks since that night. I haven't left my apartment. I don't know if I'll ever leave. Every time I try to step outside, the whispers follow me. Every time I look in a reflective surface, I see the child. Their hollow eyes, their pale face. They're always waiting for me. And I know deep down that one day soon, they'll get what they want. Story 4. The mirror in the basement. I had always loved old houses. The creaking floorboards, the musty smell in the corners. It all felt like something straight out of a classic horror novel. So when I moved into the old farmhouse just outside of town, I was thrilled. The place was perfect, with its long hallways and high ceilings. Though my friends often joked that it was too quiet, to me that was exactly what I needed. Peace, isolation, and a little space to breathe after years of city life. I never thought the quiet would eventually drive me to madness, but now I know better. The house was divided into 2 main levels, plus a vast unused attic that I had only ventured into once. The basement, however, was different. It was a dark, eerie space that seemed to swallow the light no matter how many bulbs I changed. There was one feature in the basement that caught my attention the first time I saw it: a full-length mirror. It was old, much older than the house itself, with a dark wooden frame that looked like it had been carved by hand. The glass, though, was clear, too clear. When I looked into it, I didn't just see my reflection. I saw something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there. At first, it was nothing more than a slight distortion, a shadow in the corner of the frame, a flicker that seemed to come and go with the movement of the light. I figured it was just a trick of the mind, some odd angle that made the reflection seem off. But then I started noticing other things I couldn't explain. It began with the sounds. At night, when I would head down to the basement to grab something from the pantry, I could hear faint, scratching noises from the mirror. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like something was trying to claw its way out of the glass. Every time I glanced at it, the sound would stop, but I could feel it, that sensation that something was watching me, that something was there, waiting. Then came the dreams. At first it was subtle. I would dream of standing in front of the mirror, just staring at my reflection. But the reflection wouldn't mirror my movements exactly. Sometimes I'd smile, and the reflection would show me with a blank stare. Other times I would raise my hand to wave, and the reflection would move too slowly, as if it wasn't in sync with me. I chalked it up to the stress of moving into a new place. Maybe the isolation was getting to me, I thought. Maybe I was just overtired, but the dreams grew worse. One night I dreamed that I was walking down the hallway toward the basement, as I often did in real life, except this time I felt drawn to the mirror. Something pulled me toward it, an invisible force that made my feet move against my will. I couldn't stop myself. The basement door creaked open, and there it was, sitting in the corner of the room. The full-length mirror, as if waiting for me. I approached it, slowly, and that's when I saw it. The reflection wasn't mine. It was a figure, a man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. His face was pale, like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in decades, and his smile, it was not a smile. It was a grin, stretched unnaturally across his face, as if it had been carved into him. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure in the mirror started to move, taking a step forward. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It raised its hand, as if to beckon me closer. When I woke up, drenched in sweat, my first instinct was to dismiss the dream. It was just a dream. But I knew something wasn't right. The basement mirror had somehow become part of my reality. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was off with that mirror. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went down to the basement, telling myself that I was just being ridiculous. I stood in front of the mirror, my own reflection staring back at me. But for a moment, I felt as though the reflection wasn't mine. I could sense something else, something lurking beneath the surface of the glass. The mirror had always been there, but now it was different. It was as if it had a mind of its own, as if it was waiting for something or someone. I turned away quickly, my pulse racing, and decided to cover the mirror. I grabbed a sheet from the laundry room and draped it over the frame. The moment I covered it, I felt a sense of relief, as though I had removed a weight from my shoulders. But that night, the scratching returned. It was louder now, persistent, like nails on glass, scraping and scratching, growing more frantic with each passing second. I tried to ignore it, tried to drown it out with music, but it wouldn't stop. It became impossible to ignore, and that's when I saw it. The sheet covering the mirror was moving. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe the old house creaking, but no, the sheet was billowing out, as though something was inside the mirror, pushing against it. I rushed downstairs, my heart pounding, and pulled the sheet off. The mirror was completely still. The scratching had stopped. But now there was something new. The reflection in the glass was not mine. It wasn't the mirror at all. The reflection showed only darkness, a black void that seemed to pulse and breathe, like something waiting to pull me in. I stepped back, terrified. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My head was spinning. The next thing I knew, I had stumbled back into the wall, gasping for air. And that's when I heard the voice. It was faint, a whisper, but it came from the mirror. "You can't leave." I stumbled back toward the stairs, but I could still feel it, the pull of the mirror, drawing me in, as if it wanted to keep me there, forever. I don't know what happened after that. Maybe I lost track of time, or maybe the fear just overtook me. All I know is that I left that house. I packed up what I could and never looked back. But even now, when I pass by an old mirror, I can still hear it. The scratching, the whispering, and the feeling that something is watching me from the other side. Story 5. The Man Behind the Window. I've always hated the windows at night. Growing up, I'd sit at my desk, and my gaze would inevitably drift toward the window. I don't know what it was, but something about the darkness outside always unsettled me. It wasn't just the fact that it was dark. It was the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I tried to ignore it, but the fear never really left. When I finally moved out and into my own apartment, I thought I would feel liberated, free from the constant weight of fear that had followed me for years. But as soon as I settled into the new apartment, I realized that my old fear hadn't gone away. It was still there. In fact, it was worse. The apartment was small, with just a single bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room. It was on the ground floor, facing a row of trees and a street that was barely used at night. From my couch, I could look straight out the window and see the moonlight filtering through the branches. At night, it felt peaceful. Too peaceful, in fact. I should have felt safe, but instead, the window became a source of anxiety. One night, after a long day of work, I sat on the couch watching TV. The lights in the room were dim, and the only sound was the hum of the television. My mind wandered, as it often did, to the window. I couldn't help it. I glanced over at it. The street outside was empty, but something caught my eye. There, in the reflection of the window, was someone standing outside. I froze, staring at the reflection. The figure was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so, standing completely still in the shadows. I couldn't see any features. It was just a dark silhouette. My heart pounded in my chest. For a moment, I wondered if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Someone was out there. I quickly turned my head, expecting to see the person standing outside. But when I looked, there was no one. The street was empty. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but no one was there. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself that it was just my imagination, or maybe I had seen a shadow cast by the trees. But then, the next night, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, the same as before, when I glanced toward the window. The figure was back. This time it was closer, I could see it more clearly in the reflection. The tall, thin silhouette was standing right in front of the window looking directly at me. I didn't turn to check if it was real this time. I was too terrified. Instead, I grabbed my phone and texted my friend, asking if they could come over. I needed someone to be here with me, to tell me that I wasn't going crazy. But as I sent the message, I glanced up again. The figure wasn't there. The street was empty. But something felt off. Something felt wrong. The third night was when everything changed. I was almost used to the figure by then, or at least I thought I was. I had started staying up later, trying to keep myself occupied until I was too tired to think about it. But on the third night, something was different. The figure was no longer just a silhouette in the window. It was closer than ever before. I had just finished eating dinner and was about to get up when I noticed it. This time, it wasn't reflected in the glass. It was standing directly outside, its face pressed against the window. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits. No, pupils, just black voids. I could see it more clearly than ever before. I screamed and my body froze in terror. The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. It just stood there staring at me. I don't know how long I stared back at it. Time felt like it had stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My hands shook as I slowly, quietly backed away from the window. And then, it happened. I looked away for just a second, trying to compose myself, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. But the worst part? It was in the reflection. In the window, it was standing right behind me, grinning. Its teeth were sharp, jagged, like something you would see in a nightmare. And its eyes, those dark, empty pits, were locked onto mine. I ran to the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I sat there trembling for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe. My phone was on the counter, but I couldn't bring myself to grab it. I just wanted to hide, to disappear. Eventually, I left the apartment, thinking I was going crazy. I didn't want to go back. But after a few hours, I returned, half expecting the figure to be gone, like the last time. I opened the door to my apartment, my heart racing, and then I saw it. The window was wide open. I hadn't left it open. In fact, I was sure I had closed it before I left. But there it was, standing wide open. The air was cold and the room felt wrong. And just as I took a step forward to close the window, I saw it. Again, the figure. It was in the window, but this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside. It was standing behind the window, but I could see its face clearly now. A face twisted in pain and hunger, grinning like it had been waiting for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then I heard a voice, not from the figure, but from inside my own mind. "You let me in." I ran out of the apartment and didn't look back. I don't know what happened after that, but I don't care to find out. I moved out the next morning, and I haven't looked at a window the same way since. They say once something is invited in, it doesn't leave. And maybe that's true, because every time I close my eyes, I can still see the reflection, and every night I feel like it's waiting for me. Story 6, The Echoes of Their Voices. I used to think my childhood home was just an ordinary house. It was nothing special. A modest 2-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of house you could forget about unless you were standing in front of it, and even then, it seemed just like any other. But I know now that something was wrong with that house. Something I couldn't explain, even when I was old enough to understand what was happening. It all started when I was about 9. My parents had bought the house when I was little, and I'd grown up there, my memories shaping around the creaky floors and the hum of the refrigerator. But there was one thing about the house that I couldn't ignore. No matter how hard I tried, the voices. At first I thought I was just imagining things. It would happen at night. Soft, distant voices whispering from the walls. It wasn't clear what they were saying, but I would hear it all the same, as if someone was having a conversation just outside my bedroom door. The kind of voices that weren't loud enough to make out, but loud enough to keep you up at night, twisting and turning in the dark, trying to make sense of what you heard. I didn't tell my parents. They were always so busy, and when I mentioned things like that, they'd tell me it was just my imagination. Kids have active imaginations, they said, but even as I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, There was a nagging feeling in my chest that wouldn't go away. I started avoiding certain rooms in the house, the basement especially, where the voices seemed the loudest. There was always a particular corner in the basement, right next to the furnace, where I could hear the murmuring clearly. But it wasn't until I was 12 that the voices became more than just whispers. I was coming home from school one afternoon when I heard it, clearly, unmistakably. My mom's voice. It was coming from the kitchen. I froze as I walked in the door, because it wasn't just my mom talking to herself. It sounded like she was talking to someone else. I called out to her, but she didn't answer. I stood there for a moment, listening. It was the same soft conversation, but no one was there. I slowly walked into the kitchen, expecting to find my mom cooking or doing something else. But she was standing at the counter, her back to me, staring blankly at the wall. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on me. I called out again, this time louder. "Mom!" She didn't respond. I walked up to her, touched her shoulder, and she turned around, startled. "What is it, honey?" she asked, her voice just as it always was, warm and familiar. "What's the matter?" I stood there for a second, confused. I heard you talking. To someone," I said. "Who were you talking to?" My mom looked at me, puzzled. "I wasn't talking to anyone. I've been standing here by myself, sweetie." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't explain it. I just let it go. But something told me then that something was terribly wrong. The voices only grew louder after that. By the time I was 14, I could hear full conversations happening in different parts of the house. Sometimes it sounded like people arguing. Other times it was soft laughter. But always it was just out of reach, like I could never quite hear enough to make sense of it. The voices were there, but no one was. One night it happened again. I was in my room doing homework when I heard it, clear as day. My dad's voice. I got up and rushed downstairs, almost tripping on the stairs, my heart racing. This time the voices didn't sound like a distant whisper. It was loud, so loud it almost felt like someone was in the room with me. I could hear my dad clearly, saying something I didn't quite catch. But as I rounded the corner into the living room, I saw him, sitting on the couch, reading the newspaper, just as I expected. "Dad," I asked, breathless, "who were you talking to?" He looked at me, confused. "Talking to who, sweetheart?" I shook my head, trying to understand it. The voices were clear as anything, and they were coming from the living room. But my dad was alone. The air was cold, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I heard you," I stammered. "I heard you talking, like you were talking to someone else." My dad looked at me with concern, but he didn't say much. He told me it was probably just the neighbors talking through the walls, or maybe the house was settling, making noises. But I knew better. I knew what I had heard. For years I lived with it, trying to convince myself that it was just in my head. But one night when I was 17, I stayed home alone, the house completely quiet, when I heard something different. This time the voices weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the mirror. It was just past midnight. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a voice, soft, whispering, but so clear I could make out every word. "You have to listen." I immediately sat up in bed, the room dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. I felt the coldness in the air again, that heaviness, that feeling of being watched. The voice came again. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I recognized. "You have to stop ignoring us." The whisper was coming from the mirror above my dresser. I got up slowly, almost against my will, and walked toward the mirror. As I stared into it, I saw nothing but the reflection of my own room, empty and quiet. And then, as my gaze shifted toward the edges of the reflection, I saw them. Figures standing just out of the light, their faces blurred, like shadows trying to take shape. There was something so unnatural about their movement, so wrong about how they seemed to ripple and flicker at the edges of my vision. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was compelled to keep staring. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. "We were here before you. We were here long before you." In that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in that house. I had never been alone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, listening to the voices echo in the mirror. But eventually I backed away, heart pounding, and shut my eyes, hoping to block out whatever was trying to reach me. When I opened them again, the figures were gone, but the voice lingered. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I moved out as soon as I could, but even now when I visit, I still hear them. The voices, they've never stopped. Story 7, The Stranger in the Attic. The first night in my new house, I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct. It was a soft scraping, like something moving across the floor, followed by a low, almost inaudible hum. The noise came from above, from the attic. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. The place was old. A Victorian-style house with narrow hallways, creaky floors, and a steep staircase that led up to the attic. It had a charm to it, sure, but it also had an air of mystery that I couldn't quite shake. I had bought the house on a whim, eager to escape the chaos of city life and start fresh. It was affordable, located just on the outskirts of town, and had a large empty attic that I figured would be perfect for storage or a quiet workspace. It was secluded, surrounded by trees, and the nearest neighbor was several miles away. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But the next night, it happened again. This time the sound was louder. The scraping, the hum. It was clearer, as though something was moving around up there. I told myself it was just the house's old pipes, or maybe even the wind moving through the cracks. But something about it made my skin crawl, a sense that I wasn't alone in the house. I stood in the hallway, staring up at the attic door, trying to gather the courage to investigate. I had never been in the attic before. It was locked when I first moved in, and I hadn't bothered to open it yet. But now, with the sounds coming from above, I felt a strange compulsion to go up there. I found the key to the attic door in a drawer in the kitchen, buried beneath old papers left by the previous owners. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and stepped onto the stairs leading up. The air was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and mildew filling my nose. The staircase creaked with every step, and I felt an oppressive weight settle over me the higher I climbed. When I reached the top, I pushed the door open, and a gust of cold air rushed past me, making my skin prickle. The attic was pitch black, save for a faint light from a small window high on the far wall. I couldn't see much, but I could make out shapes. Old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked high, and piles of forgotten things. The silence in the room was deafening, the only sound being the occasional creak of the house settling. Then I heard it again. A soft scrape, followed by a hum. But this time, it was closer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the attic, and that's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the attic, just barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, thin, and dressed in ragged clothes, almost like a faded, old-fashioned suit. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, piercing, watching. My heart raced and I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, silent, its presence, filling the room like a heavy fog. Then the figure moved. It wasn't a quick motion, but slow, deliberate, like it was savoring each step it took toward me. I took another step back, but it didn't matter. The figure was getting closer, and I could feel its gaze burrowing into me, making my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling with fear. The figure stopped, and then it spoke. Its voice was low and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in years. "I've been waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I turned and bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my panic. I didn't dare look back as I ran down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I pressed my back against the wall, trying to calm myself. What had I seen? What was that thing? Was it real? Or had I imagined it, a trick of my mind brought on by the isolation of the house? I didn't sleep that night. The image of the figure standing so still in the attic haunted me. The voice, the words it had spoken, echoed in my mind over and over again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake by moving into this house. The next day, I didn't go near the attic. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that hung over the house, but as the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The figure in the attic, the voice, the way it had said it was waiting for me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, but every night when the house settled into its strange, quiet rhythm, I heard the scraping again, the soft hum, the faintest sound of movement. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was in that attic. That night I went back. This time I was prepared. I brought a flashlight, determined to find out what was really up there. The door creaked open as I ascended the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the darkness of the attic. I searched the room, moving quickly, my eyes darting from corner to corner, trying to find any sign of the figure. But there was nothing. No figure, no scraping, no hum. The attic was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Something that hadn't been there before. A mirror standing in the corner of the attic. It wasn't there the last time I was up, I was sure of it. It was old, the frame cracked and chipped, but the glass was perfectly clear. I walked over to it slowly, unsure of why I felt drawn to it. As I looked into the mirror, I saw myself, but then behind me I saw him, the figure, standing in the reflection, his eyes fixed on me. He wasn't in the room but in the mirror, just like before. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "You've been here before." I turned and ran, slamming the attic door behind me, but I couldn't escape it. The mirror had become a portal, a link to whatever was trapped in that attic, whatever was waiting for me. I left the house the next day, and I haven't returned since. But I know the mirror is still there, sitting in that attic, waiting. And I know deep down that one day it will call to me again. Story 8, The Visitor in the Corner. I always thought I was immune to the stories people told about haunted houses. You know, the usual things. Doors creaking open by themselves, strange whispers in the dead of night, and that unsettling feeling that someone is watching you, even when you're alone. I was never one to jump at shadows or hear things that weren't there. But then I moved into the old house. It was the perfect place for me. Quiet, isolated, and cheap. A quaint cottage just outside of town, tucked away at the end of a narrow dirt road. The kind of place people would love if they didn't know the history. I didn't care about that, though. It was perfect for someone who liked their solitude, like me. The house itself was old, of course. The floors were creaky, the windows drafty, but it had a charm to it. A big front porch that overlooked a large stretch of farmland and a massive oak tree that had to be at least 100 years old. The garden out back was wild, but that was something I enjoyed. The freedom to let it grow wild and untamed. But there was one thing about the house that always bothered me. The corner. It was a small corner of the living room, just behind the couch. Nothing special about it, really, except that every time I entered the room, I felt it. The air would grow heavier, colder, like something was pressing down on me. I couldn't explain it, but it was the first thing I noticed when I moved in, and it never went away. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I figured I was just adjusting to the house, to the unfamiliar sounds in the new space. I tried to brush it off, but as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. There was something in that corner, something I couldn't see but could always feel, a presence, a weight. One evening, after work, I decided to sit down and relax. The feeling in the corner had been gnawing at me all day, so I figured if I just ignored it, maybe it would go away. I plopped down on the couch, grabbed my book, and tried to lose myself in it. But the corner was still there, as if it was pulling my attention, tugging at the edges of my consciousness. I tried to focus on the pages, but the weight of that invisible presence pressed down on me, harder and harder. I glanced up, unable to help myself, and there it was, in the corner. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks. Maybe the shadows had shifted, and the light from the setting sun was casting strange shapes. But no, there was something there, a figure. It was just a silhouette, dark against the fading light. It was small, crouched down low, its back slightly hunched as though it was kneeling. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, again the figure was gone. Just like that. But the heaviness in the room didn't lift. The air still felt thick, and my heart pounded in my chest. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I had seen, or what I thought I had seen. Was I imagining it, or had I really seen something standing in that corner? The next day I went to work, exhausted but determined to push the thought from my mind. I didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't want to accept that something was wrong with the house, but when I came home, I was met with the same feeling, the same heaviness, in the same corner. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I knew something wasn't right. I didn't want to look, but I did anyway. The figure was there again. It was closer this time, crouched even lower, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It felt like it was aware of me, like it was waiting for me to notice it. I stood frozen, my body stiff with fear. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked onto that corner. And then it happened. The figure moved. It wasn't just standing still anymore. It moved like a creature, a thing that wasn't quite human. It didn't stand up. It crawled slowly, like a spider dragging itself across the floor, dragging its long, twisted limbs along the ground. It didn't make a sound, but I could hear it, the soft rustling, the scratching of its hands on the floorboards. And then it looked at me. I saw its face. At first it was just a blur, like something out of the corner of my eye. But as the figure drew closer, I could see it clearly. It had a pale face, featureless except for the eyes. The eyes were dark and hollow, like black pits, and they were staring right at me. I screamed, but no sound came out. The figure lunged, its limbs moving impossibly fast. And for a split second, I thought it was going to reach me. But just as quickly it stopped, and then it vanished. The room fell silent. The air felt lighter, the heaviness lifting. As quickly as it had come, I was left standing there, my chest heaving, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what had just happened. But one thing was certain. I wasn't alone in that house. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I didn't feel safe. The corner, the figure. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting for me to return. I tried to leave it all behind, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can still feel it. That weight, that presence. And I know deep down that whatever it was is still out there, still watching, waiting. Story 9. The Candlelight Curse. When I first moved into the old house on Maple Street, I had no idea what I was walking into. It was a charming, albeit aging, place with a cozy atmosphere. The walls were filled with the marks of history, the kind of history I found comforting. Old wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the fireplace still worked, producing a warm, comforting glow during chilly nights. Everything was perfect, or at least it seemed so. What truly drew me to the house was its price. I had been looking for months, and this place was affordable, even in a neighborhood where homes went for much more than they were worth. The realtor had been quick to assure me that it was only the age of the house that made it seem a little eccentric. He said the owners had moved out and left everything behind, leaving the house almost untouched for years. I didn't think anything of it at first, but I should have, because there was one detail in the house that I couldn't ignore: the candle holders. There were dozens of them scattered around the house, on the mantels, the windowsills, even in the bathrooms. Small, delicate holders, the kind of thing you'd expect in a candle shop, not in an old house. I noticed them from the moment I walked in. They were beautiful, intricate pieces of work, made of brass and silver, but they gave off an unsettling vibe. Something about them seemed out of place. The first night in the house, I decided to light a candle. It was a chilly evening, and I thought the house could use a little warmth. I picked a small candle holder near the living room fireplace, stuck a match to it, and lit the wick. The flame flickered brightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It felt peaceful, almost like a cozy scene out of a movie. but that sense of calm quickly faded. The candle burned unevenly, its flame jumping erratically. It was as if the flame was struggling to stay lit. I thought maybe it was just the drafty old house, but as I sat there, watching the candle burn, something started to feel wrong. The shadows on the wall seemed to stretch, moving in unnatural ways. The air grew thick, heavier than before, and then I heard it, a whisper, soft like a sigh in the wind. "Blow it out!" I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. I checked. The doors, the windows, and the hallways. Nothing. Just the usual quiet of an old house settling into the night. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the wind, the old wood creaking. But as I looked back at the candle, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The flame was no longer just a flicker. It was stretching, bending toward the shadows. It grew, moving in the air like it had a mind of its own. And then I heard it again. The whisper. "Blow it out." I grabbed the candle, hands trembling, and blew out the flame. The room went dark. The eerie silence returned. But something felt different. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the house itself was watching me. The feeling lingered, like a heavy weight pressing against my chest. The next day, I tried to go about my business, unpacking, cleaning, getting things in order. But everywhere I went in the house, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The candle holders were everywhere. I didn't know how I'd missed them, but now they felt like they were staring at me. That evening, I decided to try lighting another candle. I figured I could at least get some warmth while I relaxed. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a tall, elegant candle holder from the countertop. It was beautiful, silver with intricate designs etched into it. I lit the candle and set it down, hoping to get a bit of peace. The flame started to flicker almost immediately, and then the whispering began again, like a breath on the back of my neck. "Blow it out." I hesitated this time. It was the same voice, soft and insistent. The candlelight danced and cast eerie shadows on the walls. Shadows that looked like they were moving, shifting in time with the flickers of the flame. I stood still, my heart pounding. The room felt cold, colder than it should have been. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. And then, just as I was about to blow it out, the candle went out on its own. The flame extinguished in a single puff, like someone had blown it out for me. I looked around, expecting to find something, someone, anything. But the house was still silent. And then I noticed something else. The candles were changing. It started with the one in the kitchen. When I looked at the empty holder, I saw something written in the wax. A word smeared into the melted candle like it had been etched in with a knife. It said, "Leave." I stood there staring at the word, a chill crawling up my spine. I walked quickly through the house, checking each of the candle holders, and each one had the same word, etched into the wax, burned into the surface. "Leave." It was as though something, some presence, had been trying to tell me something all along. It wasn't just the house that felt wrong, it was the candles. They were the vessels of whatever presence was in that house. I tried to leave, to pack my things, but every time I walked past the hallway or near the stairs, I saw something in the reflection of the candle holders, faces distorted and blurred, but still there. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes from them. The whispers came again, louder now, echoing around me. "Leave, leave, leave!" I didn't want to stay another second. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and rushed to the door. But as I reached for the knob, the candle holders in the hallway flared to life, each one lighting in unison, their flames burning bright, casting long shadows across the walls. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and warping. And then the voices came, louder than ever. "You can't leave." I slammed the door open, ran down the stairs, and didn't stop until I was out of the house. I never went back, but sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear the whispering again, a soft, insistent voice in the wind. "Blow it out." And I know deep down that whatever was in that house, it didn't want me to leave, and it's still waiting for me to come back. Story 10. The hollow eyes I've always believed. In the supernatural, Growing up, I'd spend hours reading ghost stories, watching horror films, and sneaking into old abandoned buildings in my small town. But none of those stories prepared me for what happened to me in the old farmhouse I moved into last year. I wasn't expecting anything supernatural, to be honest. It was just an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place that was quiet and isolated, exactly what I needed after a long, grueling breakup and the constant noise of city life. I thought it would be the perfect place to recharge. The house was a bit run down, but that only added to the charm. The floors creaked, the roof leaked in the heavy rain, but the price was right. It wasn't until I moved in and started unpacking that I noticed something unusual, something unsettling. There were eyes everywhere. At first I thought it was just me, a trick of my tired eyes or some quirky feature of the house. But no matter where I turned, I found them. Eyes staring back at me from the mirrors, from the paintings on the walls, from the shadows that stretched out across the floor at night. It wasn't that the eyes were creepy or menacing. They were empty, hollow, like black pits where the soul should be. Their gaze followed me wherever I went. I couldn't ignore them. Every time I looked at a reflection, I could feel them. Every time I glanced away, I felt like I wasn't alone. Something was always watching me. But when I turned around, no one was there. The first incident that truly rattled me happened the second night I stayed in the house. I had set up my bed in the upstairs bedroom where the ceiling sloped low. I could barely sleep that night, the floorboards creaking beneath me, the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The room was pitch black, except for the faint glow of moonlight coming in through the small window above my bed. For a moment, I thought it was just the wind again, playing tricks on me. But then I saw something that froze my blood. Eyes. There was a pair of them, in the far corner of the room, glowing faintly, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I could see nothing else but those eyes, gleaming like two black holes. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, nothing. The corner was empty. The air felt heavy, like something had just been there, but had vanished. In the blink of an eye, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind seemed to carry with it a feeling of presence. And the eyes, they were always there, lurking in the corner of my vision. The next day, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But that night, it happened again. I was sitting in the living room reading when I caught a flash of movement in the hallway mirror. There they were again. This time, the eyes weren't in a corner. They were in the reflection, staring back at me. They were different, though, more alive, if that makes sense. The black void seemed to swirl like something was trying to force its way out. I jumped up and rushed to the hallway. The eyes disappeared as soon as I reached the mirror. But when I turned around to walk back into the living room, I saw them again, this time in the reflection of the window. I had had enough. I decided to leave, to get away from the house and the eyes that haunted it. I didn't care if it was just my mind playing tricks. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag, grabbed my things, and hurried out the door, convinced I would never look back. But just before I left, I glanced one last time at the house, and I saw it. The eyes were everywhere, in the upstairs window, in the attic window, peeking from behind the trees outside, all of them staring at me, watching, waiting. I drove off, and I didn't look back. But it's been a year, and the memories still haunt me. I can't shake the feeling that those eyes are following me, no matter where I go. The feeling that they're still watching. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed late at night, I swear I can see them again. Not in the room, but outside, in the reflection of the window, peering in through the darkness. I don't know who they belong to or what they want, but I know one thing. I'm never going back to that house. Not ever. Story 11. The Woman in the Mirror. I never liked mirrors, not because I believed they were cursed or haunted, but because I always had this nagging feeling that something would be in them if I looked long enough. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't a fear of my reflection. It was the fear of what I couldn't see. The feeling that I was being watched from beyond the glass. It was a feeling I could never quite shake, and I thought it was something I'd just outgrown. Until I moved into the old apartment. The apartment was small, located in a neglected building, near the edge of town. It was cheap, which was all I cared about. My finances were tight, and I needed something affordable, so I didn't ask too many questions. I signed the lease and moved in, unaware of the history of the place. It wasn't long before I realized that the apartment was strange. The air was always cold no matter how high I turned up the heater. The walls had a damp, musty smell to them, like the apartment had been sitting vacant for too long. But it was the mirrors that got to me. There was one in the hallway, just across from the kitchen. It wasn't a particularly large mirror, but it stood out. The frame was heavy, dark wood with intricate carvings, something that looked antique. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the days went by, I began to notice something odd. Whenever I walked past the mirror, I couldn't help but glance at it. And every time I did, I felt a shift in the air. A sensation that I wasn't the only one standing there. The feeling would last, only for a second, like a cold breeze sweeping through the hallway. But it was always there, like something was watching me from the reflection. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. One night after I had finished dinner and was settling in for the evening, I decided to give the mirror a closer look. It was a strange impulse, but I felt drawn to it. I stood in front of it, staring at my reflection. At first, everything was normal. My face, my clothes, the dark shadows in the hallway behind me. But then, something changed. In the reflection, I could see a figure standing behind me. At first, I thought it was just the way the light from the kitchen was casting shadows. But the figure was too distinct. It was a woman, tall, pale, with dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders. She was standing just out of focus in the corner of the reflection, her face hidden in shadow. I spun around, heart racing. The hallway was empty. Nothing but the usual darkness and quiet of the apartment. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but when I turned back to the mirror, she was still there. Now she was closer, a few inches from my reflection, her face still hidden in the shadows. I could feel her presence, something heavy and oppressive, like she was standing just behind me, waiting for me to notice her. I reached out to touch the mirror, to prove to myself that I was just imagining things. But as my fingers brushed against the glass, I felt a sharp coldness, a sensation so intense it made me flinch. The woman in the reflection didn't move. She stood perfectly still. The temperature in the hallway dropped suddenly, and I could feel the air grow heavier, thicker. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The woman's face remained in shadow, but I could see her eyes now. Dark, hollow pits, empty and staring straight through me. I took a step back again, but the woman didn't disappear. Instead, she seemed to shift, slowly, like she was floating closer, her face still hidden, but her eyes never left mine. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel her presence, like she was trying to push through the glass, to step out of the reflection and into my world. In a panic, I turned and ran out of the hallway, leaving the mirror behind. I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom, trying to calm myself, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman in the mirror, her hollow eyes staring back at me, no matter where I went. The next day, I decided I needed to get rid of that mirror. I didn't care if it was antique or valuable or whatever. I couldn't stand the thought of it being in the apartment any longer. I called a local thrift store and arranged to have it picked up. I was so relieved when I handed the mirror over to the delivery driver, hoping that was the end of it. But that night, the whispers started. I had been asleep for hours when I woke up to the sound of soft whispers, so faint I couldn't make out the words. I sat up in bed listening, my heart racing. The whispers came from the hallway. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me. I slowly got out of bed and walked to the door. The hallway was dark, but I could see the faint outline of something, a figure standing in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized her. The woman from the mirror. She was standing in the hallway facing the wall. Her hair hung over her face, but I could see the faint glint of her eyes, dark and endless, staring into nothing. Her body was hunched like she was waiting for something. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then, as though she heard my thoughts, she turned. Her face came into view. It was the same as it had been in the reflection, pale, gaunt, with eyes like black pits. But now her mouth opened, and I could hear her whisper clearly, "I'm still here." I slammed the door shut, but I could still feel her presence outside. I could feel her waiting just beyond the wood of the door. The whispers didn't stop. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags and left the apartment. I never even bothered to say goodbye to the landlord, just handed over the keys and fled. I don't know what the woman in the mirror wanted, but I wasn't about to stay around to find out. Since then, I've moved several times, but I still have the same feeling, like something is always watching me from behind the glass. Sometimes when I walk past a mirror, I feel it, the presence of those dark, empty eyes, waiting for me to look, to notice them. And every time I catch a glimpse of my own reflection, I can't shake the feeling that she's still there, standing just behind me. Story 12. The Whistler in the Dark. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? The ones who seem harmless, who blend into the background, who you never think twice about. That's how I remember my neighbor, Mr. Holloway. He was an older man in his mid-60s, a little stooped in the shoulders, and always dressed in gray. He lived in the house next door to mine, a crumbling Victorian that had been around as long as the neighborhood itself. He never caused any trouble, always keeping to himself. We'd wave every morning as we passed each other in the yard, but that was the extent of our interactions. I don't know exactly when I started hearing it. At first it was faint, a soft, almost musical sound. Drifting in from his house late at night, it sounded like someone was whistling, an eerie, mournful tune that echoed through the still air. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the wind, or maybe an old record player that Mr. Holloway liked to use late at night. But the whistling didn't stop. It was always there, just at the edge of my consciousness, like a soundtrack to the loneliness of the neighborhood. One night, I was unable to sleep. It was past midnight, and I lay awake, listening to the gentle hum of the world outside. And there it was again, the whistling. It was louder now, almost insistent, cutting through the silence like a knife. The melody was the same every night, a soft, haunting tune that I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just some strange habit Mr. Holloway had. But as the days went by, I realized that something about it felt off. I was at my kitchen window one evening, cleaning up after dinner, when I saw him standing in his yard. Mr. Holloway was on the porch, his head tilted back slightly, eyes closed, as he stood perfectly still. And then he started to whistle. But it wasn't the tune I had been hearing. This time the whistling was faster, more frantic, almost desperate. The way he stood there, motionless, his lips puckering as though he were lost in the melody, made my skin crawl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving behind him. Something tall, dark, and lurking in the corner of his porch. I wanted to look away, to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut, but I couldn't. I watched as he continued to whistle, his face expressionless, lost in whatever world he was inhabiting. The shadow in the corner of the porch seemed to grow larger, stretching unnaturally, reaching toward him. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to be witnessing this. I closed the window and hurried to bed, but the whistling continued, even after I buried my face in the pillow. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. The sound of it began to feel wrong, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground, far below the house, but still too close to ignore. The next morning, I couldn't get the image of Mr. Holloway standing there out of my mind. I was walking to my car when I saw him in his yard again. This time, he was sitting on the porch, rocking slowly back and forth, still whistling that same haunting tune. It wasn't so much the sound that bothered me anymore. It was the fact that despite being so close, I had never actually seen him. He never once acknowledged me when I waved, never made eye contact. He just kept whistling, staring straight ahead. It didn't stop there. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The whistling was louder than ever, like it was coming from inside my own house. I tossed and turned, feeling the weight of the sound press down on me, filling the air with a tension I couldn't escape. I pulled the blankets up over my head, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The whistling was too close, too real. I finally gave in and crept out of bed. I tiptoed down the hall, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I reached the front door, I peeked out the window into the dark yard next door. That's when I saw him. Mr. Holloway was standing in his yard as usual, but this time he wasn't whistling. No, he was screaming, his mouth open wide, but the sound was different. It was like he was howling in agony, writhing in pain, but his lips were still forming the whistling tune, the exact same tune that had been haunting me for weeks. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. He seemed to be pleading for something, but his eyes were shut tight. He was shaking, his whole body trembling with the force of whatever was happening. And then, something that I can't explain happened. I saw the shadow again, the one that had been lingering behind him. This time it was closer. It didn't have a clear shape, but it was like a shadowy, dark mist creeping along the ground, flowing out from the walls of his house. The shadow moved toward him, wrapping around him like a blanket, and when it touched him, the whistling stopped. Mr. Holloway dropped to his knees, his arms outstretched as though he were embracing something. His head tilted back, his mouth still open, but no sound came out. He was completely still. Then the shadow moved again. It crept toward me, slowly, as if it knew I was watching. I felt my heart race and I stumbled back from the window, fear gripping me. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I gathered the courage to go next door and check on Mr. Holloway. I rang the doorbell several times, but there was no answer. The house was silent. I tried peeking through the windows, but everything was still. I knocked on the door again, louder this time, but nothing happened. I left a note on the door, telling him I had noticed he hadn't been outside lately, and I wanted to check in on him. I never heard back. That evening, I decided to visit the local library to see if I could find out more about Mr. Holloway. It wasn't like me to poke into other people's business, but I had a feeling there was something I needed to know. I searched through old records, articles, and newspaper clippings, and that's when I found it. The obituary. It was Mr. Holloway's. The date was exactly 10 years ago. It mentioned that he had lived in the house for decades and that he passed away peacefully, except for one detail. It mentioned something about a whistling sound being heard from the house for days after his death, a sound that neighbors had all reported hearing. The report ended with a chilling note. The source of the sound was never found. I don't know what happened to Mr. Holloway that night or what caused him to scream like that, but I know this. His whistling never stopped, and sometimes late at night, I still hear it. That same tune, drifting through the darkness, coming from the empty house next door. Story 12. The Whistler in the Dark. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? The ones who seem harmless, who blend into the background, who you never think twice about. That's how I remember my neighbor, Mr. Holloway. He was an older man, in his mid-60s, a little stooped in the shoulders, and always dressed in gray. He lived in the house next door to mine, a crumbling Victorian that had been around as long as the neighborhood itself. He never caused any trouble, always keeping to himself. We'd wave every morning as we passed each other in the yard, but that was the extent of our interactions. I don't know exactly when I started hearing it. At first it was faint, a soft, almost musical sound drifting in from his house late at night. It sounded like someone was whistling, an eerie, mournful tune that echoed through the still air. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the wind, or maybe an old record player that Mr. Holloway liked to use late at night. But the whistling didn't stop. It was always there, just at the edge of my consciousness, like a soundtrack to the loneliness of the neighborhood. One night I was unable to sleep. It was past midnight, and I lay awake, listening to the gentle hum of the world outside. And there it was again, the whistling. It was louder now, almost insistent, cutting through the silence like a knife. The melody was the same every night, a soft, haunting tune that I couldn't quite place. At first I thought it was just some strange habit Mr. Holloway had, But as the days went by, I realized that something about it felt off. I was at my kitchen window one evening, cleaning up after dinner, when I saw him standing in his yard. Mr. Holloway was on the porch, his head tilted back slightly, eyes closed, as he stood perfectly still. And then he started to whistle. But it wasn't the tune I had been hearing. This time the whistling was faster, more frantic, almost desperate. The way he stood there, motionless, his lips puckering as though he were lost in the melody, made my skin crawl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving behind him. Something tall, dark, and lurking in the corner of his porch. I wanted to look away, to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut, but I couldn't. I watched as he continued to whistle, his face expressionless, lost in whatever world he was inhabiting. The shadow in the corner of the porch seemed to grow larger, stretching unnaturally, reaching toward him. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to be witnessing this. I closed the window and hurried to bed, but the whistling continued even after I buried my face in the pillow. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. The sound of it began to feel wrong, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground, far below the house, but still too close to ignore. The next morning, I couldn't get the image of Mr. Holloway standing there out of my mind. I was walking to my car when I saw him in his yard again. This time, he was sitting on the porch, rocking slowly back and forth, still whistling that same haunting tune. It wasn't so much the sound that bothered me anymore. It was the fact that, despite being so close, I had never actually seen him. He never once acknowledged me when I waved, never made eye contact. He just kept whistling, staring straight ahead. It didn't stop there. That night I couldn't sleep again. The whistling was louder than ever, like it was coming from inside my own house. I tossed and turned, feeling the weight of the sound press down on me, filling the air with a tension I couldn't escape. I pulled the blankets up over my head, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The whistling was too close, too real. I finally gave in and crept out of bed. I tiptoed down the hall, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I reached the front door, I peeked out the window into the dark yard next door. That's when I saw him. Mr. Holloway was standing in his yard as usual, but this time he wasn't whistling. No, he was screaming, his mouth open wide. But the sound was different. It was like he was howling in agony, writhing in pain, but his lips were still forming the whistling tune. The exact same tune that had been haunting me for weeks. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. He seemed to be pleading for something, but his eyes were shut tight. He was shaking, his whole body trembling with the force of whatever was happening. And then, something that I can't explain happened. I saw the shadow again, the one that had been lingering behind him. This time it was closer. It didn't have a clear shape, but it was like a shadowy dark mist creeping along the ground, flowing out from the walls of his house. The shadow moved toward him, wrapping around him like a blanket, and when it touched him, the whistling stopped. Mr. Holloway dropped to his knees, his arms outstretched as though he were embracing something. His head tilted back, his mouth still open, but no sound came out. He was completely still. Then the shadow moved again. It crept toward me slowly, as if it knew I was watching. I felt my heart race, and I stumbled back from the window, fear gripping me. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I gathered the courage to go next door and check on Mr. Holloway. I rang the doorbell several times, but there was no answer. The house was silent. I tried peeking through the windows, but everything was still. I knocked on the door again, louder this time, but nothing happened. I left a note on the door, telling him I had noticed he hadn't been outside lately and I wanted to check in on him. I never heard back. That evening, I decided to visit the local library to see if I could find out more about Mr. Holloway. It wasn't like me to poke into other people's business, but I had a feeling there was something I needed to know. I searched through old records, articles, and newspaper clippings, and that's when I found it. The obituary. It was Mr. Holloway's. The date was exactly 10 years ago. It mentioned that he had lived in the house for decades and that he passed away peacefully, except for one detail. It mentioned something about a whistling sound being heard from the house for days after his death, a sound that neighbors had all reported hearing. The report ended with a chilling note. The source of the sound was never found. I don't know what happened to Mr. Holloway that night or what caused him to scream like that, but I know this: his whistling never stopped. And sometimes late at night, I still hear it, that same tune, drifting through the darkness, coming from the empty house next door. Story 14, The Hollow Footsteps. The first time I heard them, I was 14. It was late one evening, and I was in the living room watching TV. I had just moved into my grandmother's house a few weeks prior, after my parents passed away in a car accident. The house was huge, far larger than I needed for myself, but I had no choice. My grandmother insisted I move in with her, and I wasn't in the mood to argue. It was an old house built in the late 1800s, and it came with all the quirks you'd expect from something that had stood for so long. Creaking floorboards, doors that didn't quite shut right, and windows that rattled in the wind. I didn't mind it, at least not at first. It was comforting in its own way, like the house had a soul. But one night, when I was sitting alone in the living room, I started to hear something. Something I couldn't explain. It started softly, the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. The old familiar sound of a foot dragging across the floor, followed by a soft thud, like something being gently dropped. At first, I figured it was my grandmother walking around the house, maybe checking on me, or perhaps just going about her nightly routine. But when I glanced at the clock, I saw that it was 2:30 a.m., much later than she normally stayed up. I waited a few more minutes, listening. The footsteps were getting closer. Tap, tap, tap. I got up from the couch, feeling a chill in the air, and crept toward the stairs. I paused for a moment at the bottom of the staircase, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, slowly, almost methodically, like they were moving around the second-floor hallway. I called out, hesitant, "Grandma?" There was no answer. The footsteps kept going, though, as though they hadn't heard me. They were slow at first, then, as I stood there listening, they grew louder, heavier, like someone was walking directly above me, pacing back and forth in the hallway. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. My grandmother had been sound asleep earlier when I checked on her, and her door was still closed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Grandma?" I called again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I slowly started up the stairs, my heart racing. As I reached the top, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood in the hallway, staring down the dark corridor toward my grandmother's room. The light was still on, but the door was closed. I walked toward it cautiously, the weight of the silence pressing on me. I knocked softly, afraid of what I might find. No answer. I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. My grandmother was lying in bed, sound asleep, exactly where I had left her. I froze in the doorway, unable to move. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I felt as though I had just disturbed something that had been walking around in the house in her place. I quickly closed the door and went back downstairs, trying to shake off the unease that had settled deep in my bones. I told myself it was just my imagination, the stress of everything finally getting to me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I had heard, and I couldn't unhear it. The next morning, I asked my grandmother if she had been up the night before, walking around. She looked at me puzzled. "No, dear, I didn't get out of bed all night," she said, her voice kind and soothing. "Are you sure you heard something?" I nodded, but I didn't press the issue. I didn't want to sound paranoid, especially when she seemed so unaffected by the idea. But after that, the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, night after night. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was the house settling or the wind. But the more I heard them, the more I realized that they weren't the same as the creaks of the house. These were deliberate, steady, pacing footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking around above me every night. And then it started getting worse. The footsteps started to happen during the day. In the afternoon, while I was sitting at my desk doing homework, I'd hear the sound of footsteps again, echoing through the upstairs hallway. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm, slow and deliberate. It wasn't just at night anymore. It was happening in broad daylight. It was as though the house was coming alive. Finally, one day, I decided to confront it. I couldn't keep ignoring it. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up to the attic, hoping to find some logical explanation. Maybe an animal had gotten into the walls, or maybe there was an old floorboard creaking from the wind. The attic was dark, and the floor was covered in dust and cobwebs. As I moved around, my flashlight flickered. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, shining the light on the boxes, the old furniture, and the piles of junk that had accumulated over the years. I reached the back corner, where I found an old cracked mirror. It was covered in dust, but as I wiped it off, I saw something strange. There in the reflection, I saw someone standing behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. I stared at the mirror, my eyes wide. The reflection wasn't of me. It was a shadowy figure, tall and thin, standing just a few feet behind me. The figure's face was obscured in the shadows, but I could see its eyes. Two hollow, dark pits staring directly at me. I screamed and dropped the flashlight, running down the stairs faster than I ever had in my life. I locked myself in my room, my heart racing. I couldn't understand what was happening. The footsteps came that night, as they always did. But this time they were different. They weren't just coming from the upstairs hallway. They were coming closer, louder, closer to my bedroom door. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards as something, or someone, walked slowly toward me. Suddenly, the door to my room creaked open. The air turned cold, and I felt the presence behind the door. "I'm here," it whispered, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from inside my head. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had opened, the door slammed shut. The footsteps stopped. The house went silent again. But I knew then that I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay in that house with whatever was walking around, watching me. The footsteps, the whispering voice, the figure in the mirror. They were all connected, and I wasn't safe. I moved out the next day, leaving my grandmother's house behind. But every once in a while, I'll hear the footsteps again. In the dead of night, when I'm alone, I hear them. Soft, hollow, coming from somewhere just behind me. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that house, it's still walking. Story 15, The Shadow in the Closet. My family moved to a new town when I was 16. It wasn't anything special, just a small town nestled between hills surrounded by forests. The house we bought was a bit old, but it was spacious enough for the 5 of us. My parents, my younger brother, and my 2 sisters were all excited about the change. I, however, wasn't as thrilled. I had just started getting comfortable in my old home, and leaving my friends behind wasn't easy. The house itself was strange. It had the typical creaks of any old house, but there was something unsettling about it. From the moment we stepped inside, there was a heavy feeling in the air, as though the house had a history that it didn't want to share. I was given the smallest bedroom in the house, located at the end of the hallway. The room was cramped, but the worst part was the closet. It wasn't a normal closet. It was huge, taking up nearly a quarter of the room. The door was heavy, made of old oak, and it seemed to have a strange presence. It wasn't just that it was big, it felt like something was inside it, watching me. I couldn't explain why, but every time I opened the closet door, I felt a cold draft rush out, and I could never shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to ignore it at first. It was just my imagination, I thought. A new place, a new environment. I was probably just adjusting, but then the nightmares started. The first dream was simple. I was standing in the middle of the room, looking at the closet. The door was ajar, just slightly, and there was something dark inside. Something I couldn't see clearly, but I knew it was watching me. In the dream, I reached out to close the door, but as my hand touched the handle, something grabbed my wrist. The grip was cold, like ice, and it felt like it was pulling me inside the closet. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing. At first, I chalked it up to stress, But as the days went on, the dreams got worse. The shadowy figure in the closet became clearer, and I could feel its presence even when I was awake. I'd walk past the closet and feel its coldness, and every time I looked at the door, it seemed to be just slightly more open than it had been before. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was inside the closet. I stood in front of it, staring at the wooden door, my heart pounding. I slowly reached for the handle, expecting anything like to happen. But I didn't feel the cold touch this time. I felt nothing. I pulled the door open, and the closet was completely empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. There was nothing there, just old boxes and a few discarded clothes. I figured I was just being dramatic. That night, I slept with the closet door wide open. I didn't want to feel trapped, and I convinced myself that the dreams would stop if I just confronted the closet. But they didn't. The next nightmare was more vivid than the others. I was lying in bed, just like I was in real life, when I woke up to hear a sound. The closet door was wide, open, and a shadow, a tall, shifting shape, was standing in the doorway. I could hear it breathing, slow and labored. But its eyes, those eyes, were what terrified me. They were glowing, an unnatural shade of pale green, and they were fixed on me, piercing through the dark. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was paralyzed, and the shadow just stood there waiting. Suddenly, the figure lunged at me, and I woke up, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. I looked around the room, but the closet door was shut, just like it had been before. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching me from inside the closet. The next day, I went to my parents. I told them about the nightmares, about the figure in the closet, but they brushed it off. "It's just a phase," my dad said. "Everyone gets scared of the dark when they're growing up." I didn't want to argue, but I could feel that they weren't taking me seriously. That night, I decided to stay up late and watch TV in the living room, hoping to escape the anxiety that had settled in my bedroom. But at 3 a.m., I heard something, a tapping. It was faint at first, just a soft tap, tap, tap against the wall. But it grew louder and more frantic, like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I followed the sound, walking slowly down the hallway until I reached my room. The sound was coming from inside the closet. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to see what was inside, but something inside me, some force I couldn't control, made me step forward. I grabbed the handle, my hands shaking. When I opened the door, I saw it. The closet was empty, just like before. But the shadow wasn't there. There was something else. It was written on the wall inside the closet, scrawled in red, dripping down the walls like fresh blood. The letters were jagged, uneven, and they spelled out one word: leave. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that whatever was in the house didn't want me there. The next day, I packed my things and moved into a hotel. I couldn't bring myself to stay another night in that room, and I didn't care how much I had to pay for a room at the nearest motel. I haven't been back to that house since. I never told my parents why I left so suddenly. The house was eventually sold, and as far as I know, it still stands. Abandoned, empty, just like it was before. But sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear that tapping. I still feel the cold presence of something standing in the closet, waiting for me to come back. And I know deep down that whatever it was inside that house, it's still waiting. Story 16, The Unseen Neighbor. The first thing that struck me when I moved into the old townhouse was how quiet the neighborhood was. It was the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves, and the houses were spaced just far enough apart to give you a sense of privacy. I liked it that way. After a hectic few years in the city, I was looking for some peace, a place to unwind and clear my head. The townhouse was small, but it had charm. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the wood had that worn, comforting smell that comes with age. The neighborhood was a mix of old houses, some well-kept and others falling apart, but there was something oddly peaceful about it. As I settled in, I noticed my neighbors were a quiet bunch. No, one really bothered you unless it was absolutely necessary. At first, I didn't think much of the strange happenings. I'd been living in the townhouse for about a week when I first noticed the knocking. It wasn't loud at first, just soft taps, as though someone was gently knocking on my front door. I'd go to answer it, but when I opened the door, no one would be there. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it happened again the next night. And the next, I figured it, was just a coincidence. Maybe a neighbor had the wrong house number or was trying to get in touch with someone else. It wasn't until I heard the knocking during the day that I started to feel uneasy. One afternoon, I was sitting in my living room when the distinct sound of a knock echoed through the front door. I jumped up and walked to the door, half expecting to find someone there this time. But when I opened it, there was only the quiet street outside. I looked around for a few seconds before closing the door and locking it, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The next day, I decided to confront it. I opened the door again, stepping out onto the porch. The air was still, and there was no one in sight. I walked around the front of the house, checking the yard and the sidewalk, but there was nothing. It wasn't until I walked around the side of the house that I saw it. My neighbor's window was wide open, and I could see a shadowy figure standing inside, watching me. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew I was being observed. I froze for a moment, staring at the figure, and then it slowly disappeared from view. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't recognize the figure. I had never seen anyone in that window before. The house next door had always seemed quiet, with no movement at all. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me. That night, the knocking came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a soft tap, tap, tap. It was insistent, harder, louder, like someone was demanding to be let in. I felt a cold sweat break out across my body as I stood frozen, my heart racing. I grabbed the doorknob, my hand trembling, and opened the door cautiously. There was no one there. I stepped outside, looking down the street. Everything seemed normal, but something felt off. I walked around the house again, and this time, I noticed something strange. The curtains in my neighbor's window were closed, the same window where I had seen the shadowy figure earlier. I didn't know what to think anymore. The strange knocking continued for several nights, but when I went outside to check, no one was ever there. My neighbor's house remained eerily quiet. No movement, no cars, no signs of life. After a week of this, I decided to pay my neighbor a visit. I hadn't seen them since I moved in, and I thought maybe it was time to introduce myself. I grabbed a bottle of wine and walked over to the townhouse next door. The front door was locked, but I could see a faint light shining from behind the curtains. I knocked, trying to be polite. No answer. I knocked again, a little harder this time, but there was still no answer. I was just about to leave when I noticed something strange. The doorknob turned, the door creaked open slightly, and I found myself staring into the dark hallway of my neighbor's house. It was unnervingly silent. I took a hesitant step forward, but before I could go any further, I heard it. A low, guttural whisper came from the shadows inside. "Don't come in." The door slammed shut before I could even react. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood frozen in place, staring at the closed door. I didn't know what to make of it. I was just about to knock again when I heard the familiar knock. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door in front of me. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I ran back to my house, my pulse racing. The feeling of being watched had never been so intense, and I couldn't shake the thought of what I had heard. Don't come in. What did that even mean? I couldn't stop thinking about it. My stomach twisted with dread. For the next few days, I stayed inside, keeping to myself. The knocking continued, but I didn't go outside to check anymore. It was as though my neighbor's house had become a place of forbidden territory. I knew something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. Then one morning, a for sale sign appeared in front of my neighbor's house. No explanation, no warning, just the sign. The house was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I never found out what happened to my neighbor. No one in the neighborhood knew them well enough to ask, but from that day on, the knocking stopped. The air seemed lighter, the neighborhood quieter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been released when the house was sold. A presence, a spirit, something that had been waiting. Sometimes when I walk past that house, I can still hear the faintest sound, just barely audible, a soft, insistent knocking coming from behind the walls. I'm convinced that my neighbor wasn't the one who lived there. It was something else. Story 17, The Watcher in the Woods. I've always been drawn to the woods. There's something about the way the trees stretch up to the sky, how the sunlight filters through the leaves and creates patterns on the forest floor. Growing up, my family spent every summer in a cabin deep in the woods, far away from civilization. I loved it there. The peace, the isolation, it felt like a different world entirely. But over the years, I learned that some things in the woods shouldn't be disturbed. It was the summer of my 19th year when things took a turn. My parents were out of town, and I had the cabin all to myself. I decided to take a few days off from work and spend some time reconnecting with nature. It had been a while since I'd visited, and I was excited to be back in the place I loved so much. The first day was perfect. I spent hours hiking along the familiar trails, breathing in the fresh, earthy air, and soaking in the quiet beauty of the forest. But by the second evening, something felt off. It started subtly, like a prickle at the back of my neck, a feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd look over my shoulder, but the forest would be just as still as ever, the trees silent in the cool evening air. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I was alone in a remote cabin in the woods. It's normal to feel a little on edge. But then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely perceptible over the rustling of the trees. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I strained my ears, listening. The whispering came again, this time louder. It was a voice, low and soft, but there was something about it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It sounded like it was coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The woods were as empty as they had been before. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was the wind. Maybe a trick of the trees. I took a deep breath, turned back around, and continued walking. But the whispering didn't stop. It followed me, always just behind me, as though someone was walking along the trail, only a few steps away. By the time I reached the cabin, I was breathing heavily, my pulse racing. I slammed the door behind me, hoping that whatever had been out there would stay outside. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispering again, soft and insistent, like it was calling my name. It wasn't until the next morning that I finally managed to fall asleep, but the strange feeling that I was being watched never quite left. The next day, I decided to head back to town for some supplies. I needed to clear my head and get away from the woods for a bit. The drive was peaceful, and I tried to shake off the nagging sense of unease that had followed me. When I returned to the cabin later that evening, I found something that made my blood run cold. The front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left. In fact, I always made sure to double check. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open, my eyes scanning the room. Everything looked undisturbed, nothing out of place. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the footprints. There were prints in the dust on the floor, leading from the door to the window and then back again. But the strangest part was that the prints weren't mine. They were barefoot, large and uneven, like something heavy had walked through the room, leaving deep impressions in the dust. I rushed to the window looking outside, but there was no sign of anyone. The yard was quiet. The woods beyond were still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been in the cabin with me. That night, I didn't dare go to bed early. I sat in the living room, keeping the lights on, my eyes constantly darting toward the window, the door, the shadows in the corners of the room. As the hours passed, the whispering started again. This time it was louder, clearer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was coming from the woods. I looked out the window, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain the noise. The trees were swaying slightly in the breeze, their branches creaking in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone. The whispering grew, louder, more urgent. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the woods, somewhere far away, but it felt close. I felt like I was being drawn to it, like it was calling me. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. The night was cold and the air smelled like damp earth. I walked down the trail, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whispering seemed to surround me, as though the trees themselves were whispering secrets in my ear. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, my steps quickening. The whispering grew louder, and now I could make out the words, "Come closer." I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. The beam of light flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A shadow, tall and indistinct, moving just outside the range of the flashlight. It was gone before I could focus on it. I turned to run back to the cabin, but I felt a presence behind me. Something was following me, moving silently through the trees. I didn't dare look back. I reached the cabin in a panic, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't stop shaking. That night I heard it again, the whispering, calling me from the woods. But this time, it was accompanied by a low, guttural sound, like something was breathing in the darkness, its presence heavy and oppressive. I couldn't stay there another night. The next morning I packed my things and left the cabin behind. I didn't care about the cost of leaving early or about the money I'd already spent. I just needed to get away from the woods. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know that the woods around that cabin are not the peaceful place I once thought them to be. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again, and I know that whatever was calling me that night, it's still out there, watching, waiting. Story 18, The Guest Who Never Left. The first time I noticed him was when I was sitting in the kitchen late at night, sipping on a cup of tea after a long, exhausting day. I had just moved into the house a few months ago, a charming two-story cottage tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by a small, overgrown garden. The house had been on the market for quite a while, and I had bought it on a whim. It was perfect for someone who liked to be alone, like me. The house itself had character, with creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and large windows that let in a lot of light. But there was always something about the house that felt off, a subtle sense of unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the adjustment to a new place. One evening, while I sat in the kitchen, I saw him. It was through the large kitchen window, just as dusk was settling over the neighborhood, a man standing in the garden. At first I thought it was a neighbor, maybe someone from the house next door who had wandered into my yard by mistake. But then I realized something. He wasn't moving, not at all. He stood perfectly still, staring at my house with an unnerving intensity, as though he were waiting for something. I tried to ignore the feeling of discomfort that crept over me. Maybe he was lost, or perhaps he was just admiring the house. But the longer I stared at him, the more uneasy I felt. He wore a dark, old-fashioned coat that didn't seem to fit with the time period. It was like something out of the 1800s, too formal for the casual suburban neighborhood. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence felt too tangible, too real. I grabbed my phone thinking I might call a neighbor or the police, but before I could dial, the man disappeared. He was gone, just like that, without a trace. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, a figment of my imagination. I had been stressed lately, adjusting to the new house, unpacking, and dealing with the isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next night I was in the kitchen again, this time earlier in the evening. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see him, but nothing. No man standing in the garden, no strange figure in the shadows. Just the normal quiet of the neighborhood. I felt relief wash over me. But that night, just as I was about to go to bed, I heard it. A knocking. It came from the front door. 3 solid knocks, each one louder than the last. I froze, unsure of what to do. No one came by at this hour, and I certainly wasn't expecting any visitors. The knocking continued, insistent, like someone was demanding to be let in. I reluctantly walked to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. The cold sweat that started to beat on the back of my neck told me something wasn't right. I opened the door and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The porch light cast an eerie glow over the front steps, but there was nothing there. No trace of anyone having been near the door. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like someone was watching me, hiding in the shadows, waiting. The days passed, and I tried to put the strange incidents behind me, but it kept happening. I'd see the man in the garden from time to time, always standing still, always staring. His face never came into the light, always hidden in the shadows of his dark coat. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find something that made my stomach drop. The front door was wide open. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. I never did. Panic surged through me as I stepped inside, scanning the house. The silence was thick, oppressive. I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I checked every room from the living room to the upstairs bedrooms, but everything seemed normal. Nothing was disturbed. No sign of anyone, except the footprints. There were muddy prints leading from the front door, across the hallway, and into the kitchen. The prints were large, like a man's shoes, but they seemed to be leaving an unsettling trail. The mud wasn't the usual kind either. It was dark, almost black, and it left an oily residue that seemed to smear across the floor. I followed the trail, my heart in my throat. It led to the kitchen, where the prints disappeared right next to the window. But there was no sign of the man, no trace of him, just the trail of strange, muddy footprints. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. The feeling of being watched had grown too intense. It wasn't just the man outside anymore. It was something inside the house. The last straw came a week later when I found a note on the kitchen counter. It was handwritten, in a neat, precise script. "I've been waiting for you." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't want to find out. I packed my bags that same night and left the house. I stayed with a friend for a few days, not sure if I'd ever go back. The strange incidents, the figure in the garden, the feeling of someone always watching. I couldn't take it anymore. The house is still there, sitting quietly in the neighborhood, but I haven't returned. I'm sure the man is still there, waiting. The thing I can't shake is that he wasn't just a stranger. He knew me. He knew I was coming. And the most chilling part? I've since learned that the house was built over an old property, one that was once occupied by a man who disappeared under mysterious circumstances over a century ago. The figure, the footprints, the notes, they were his. And now, I know, he's not gone. He's just waiting. Story 19, The Eyes Behind the Curtain. I had never been superstitious. I was the kind of person who thought ghost stories were just that, stories. I'd heard them all, the ones about creepy houses, mysterious disappearances, and restless spirits that couldn't move on. But for me, it was always easy to dismiss them. I was rational, grounded in the belief that everything could be explained with reason and science. That was until I moved into the house. It was an old place, a Victorian-style home with peeling paint and overgrown ivy creeping up the walls. But it was charming in its own way. The rent was affordable, and it was located on a quiet street at the edge of town, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was the kind of house that looked like it had seen better days, but still had a sense of grandeur about it, like it had lived through decades of stories. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. I unpacked my things, settled in, and began adjusting to my new space. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd, though. Every time I looked out the front window, there was an uncomfortable feeling in the air dot. It wasn't that the view was bad. The street was lined with trees and old abandoned houses. No, it was the feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off. After all, it was an old house, and perhaps it was just the isolation making me paranoid. I'd never lived alone in a house this big, and I was still getting used to the quiet. One evening, after a long day at work, I decided to relax with a book. I sat in my favorite chair by the window, sipping tea, enjoying the peaceful solitude. As I read, I felt that same strange sensation, the feeling that someone was staring at me. I looked up, expecting to see a neighbor walking by or maybe someone outside. But there was nothing, just the empty street, the moonlight casting shadows across the pavement. Yet as I sat there, the sensation only grew stronger. It was like there were eyes on me. I glanced at the curtains, slightly parted, and there it was. Two dark eyes staring back at me from outside the window. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was small, almost childlike, its face hidden in the darkness. But the eyes were clear, and they were focused on me, unwavering. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't blink, as I stared at those eyes. There was no movement, no sound, just those eyes peering through the curtain, watching me. I quickly turned away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure what to think. Could it have been a trick of the light? A reflection? I didn't know, but I was too shaken to stay where I was. I moved to the back of the house, away from the window, trying to calm myself. Later that night, I decided to check. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe someone had been walking by. I went outside and stood in front of the window, looking up at the curtain. There was nothing. No sign of anyone. I let out a relieved sigh, convinced it had been a moment of imagination. But the next night it happened again. This time I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I felt the same oppressive weight in the air. I glanced up and there they were again, the eyes peering through the curtains. But this time they were closer, almost as if they had moved, pressing closer to the glass, watching me intently. I stood up quickly, my legs trembling. I walked over to the window and threw the curtains open, expecting to see someone standing there, maybe a neighbor or a passerby. But there was no one, just the empty street, the same as before. I shut the curtains again, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Someone was watching me, and I didn't know why. The next morning, I decided to ask around. I ran into one of my neighbors, an older woman who had lived on the street for years, and mentioned the eyes in the window. She didn't seem shocked by my story, but her expression grew serious. She leaned in closer and whispered, "That house, it has a history." I felt a chill run through me. Years ago, she continued, a little girl lived there. She was always staring out the window, just like you saw. The neighbors used to see her in the window at all hours, even when no one was supposed to be there. But after she disappeared, well, they say her spirit never left. People say her eyes are always watching. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just an old woman's tale. But something about the way she said it, the way her eyes darkened, made me feel uneasy. I thanked her and walked back to my house, feeling like I had just stepped into something I couldn't quite understand. That night, I tried to ignore it. I closed the curtains tightly, locked the windows, and stayed away from the front room. But around midnight, I heard it, a soft knocking on the window. It was gentle at first, like someone tapping with their fingers, but it grew louder, more urgent, until the tapping sounded like pounding. I couldn't move. My heart raced as I stared at the closed curtains, wondering what to do. The pounding continued, relentless, as if something wanted to get in. I finally gathered the courage to walk over to the window and pull open the curtains. There was no one there, but as I stared out into the darkness, I saw something else, something I hadn't noticed before. The eyes. They weren't outside this time. They were reflected in the glass, two dark, hollow eyes staring back at me. The same eyes I had seen so many times before, but this time, they were inside the house behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I ran to the back of the house, locked all the doors, and shut all the windows. I spent the rest of the night in a haze of fear, unsure of what was real anymore. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't be in that house with those eyes watching me. I stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to calm myself, trying to forget. I never went back to the house, but sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still feel them. The eyes watching, waiting, just beyond the curtains. And I know that no matter where I go, they're still out there. They will always be there. Story 20, The Room at the End of the Hall. I never thought I'd be one of those people who believed in haunted houses, but when I moved into the old apartment on Willow Lane, I quickly learned that sometimes the things you don't believe in can become your greatest fears. The building itself was ancient, at least 100 years old. It was one of those places that had character. Exposed brick, tall windows, and narrow hallways that seemed to go on forever. I loved it at first. The apartment was affordable, and the location was perfect. It was in the heart of the city, close to work and everything else I needed. It was ideal. I had a spacious one-bedroom unit on the top floor. The ceilings were high, and there were wooden beams running across the ceiling, giving the place an old-world charm. But there was something about the apartment that always felt a little off. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe it was the strange smell that never quite went away, or the way the floors creaked at all hours of the day and night. Maybe it was just the weight of the building's history, but I couldn't help feeling like I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to living in an old building, and I pushed those thoughts aside. But then I noticed something strange. At the end of the hall, just past my bedroom door, there was a small room. It wasn't listed on the apartment floor plan, and no one ever mentioned it when I moved in. It was almost as though the room didn't exist. The door to it was old, solid wood and slightly warped, like it hadn't been opened in years. It was sealed shut, the knob rusted over with age. I never gave it much thought until one night I heard something coming from it. It started with a faint scratching sound. At first I thought it was just a mouse or something small scurrying in the walls, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone was trying to get out. I stood frozen in my bedroom doorway, staring at the door at the end of the hall. The scratching was growing louder now, a harsh, desperate sound. It wasn't a mouse. It wasn't an animal at all. It sounded like a person trapped inside, clawing at the walls. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, listening to the sound coming from behind the sealed door. The scratching lasted for what felt like hours until it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but there was no explanation. There was only that sound, the sound of something trapped in that room. The next morning I decided to investigate. I didn't want to, but I had to. I had to know what was behind that door. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the building, and stopped in front of the door at the end of the hall. The knob was cold under my hand, and the door felt oddly heavy, like it was resisting my touch. I turned the knob. The door opened with an unsettling creak. Beyond it was a small, dimly lit room, filled with dust and cobwebs. The walls were lined with old bookshelves, but the shelves were empty, except for a few yellowed papers scattered across the floor. There was a small window on one wall, but the glass was cracked and the light outside was dim, as though it had been shut out for years. I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the air grow colder, and I noticed that the floor was covered in dust, except for one thing: footprints. The prints were fresh, as though someone had walked through the dust just moments ago. They led across the room to the far corner, where there was a strange old-fashioned chair facing the wall. The chair was empty, but the air around it felt thick, heavy, as though it had been occupied recently. I took a step closer to the chair, and that's when I saw it, a small scrap of paper lying on the seat. I picked it up cautiously, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. The paper was yellowed with age, and the writing on it was faded, but I could still make out a few words. "Don't open the door." My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. The room was still, quiet, and empty. The rayador scratching sound had stopped, but now there was a deep sense of unease in the air. The room felt wrong, like something was watching me. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I stood in the hallway, my hands shaking as I stared at the door. The scratching sound had stopped, but I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that whatever had been behind that door had been waiting for me to open it. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the presence in the room, as though something was still trapped behind that door, trying to get out. I thought I heard scratching again, faint at first, then growing louder. just like before. It felt like the building was alive, like the walls themselves were breathing, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rent or the lease. I couldn't stay there any longer. I left the apartment that day and never returned. I never found out what was behind that door. The landlord called me later to ask if I'd left for good, and I told him I was moving out. When he asked if anything had happened, I didn't say a word. I didn't mention the scratching or the chair or the footprints. I couldn't. I don't know what was in that room, but every time I close my eyes, I hear the sound of scratching, and I know that whatever was behind that door, it's still there. Story 21, The Man in the Attic. I've always been a night owl. I've spent countless evenings sitting up late, reading, writing, or just thinking. I enjoy the silence that comes with the night, the peace that allows my mind to wander freely without the distractions of the day. But after I moved into the old house on Maple Street, I learned that silence isn't always peaceful. I had just moved in, looking for a fresh start after a rough breakup. The house was old but spacious, with hardwood floors and high ceilings, the kind of place that felt full of history. It had been on the market for a while, and I was able to get a good deal on it. At first, I didn't think much of the creaky stairs or the slightly crooked windows. It added character, I thought. Little did I know, the house's character had a much darker side. The first couple of nights went by without incident. I settled into my new routine, unpacked my things, and enjoyed the peace of the house. But after a few days, I began to hear noises at night. At first, they were small sounds like the settling of an old house, creaks in the floorboards, the rustle of paper in the wind, the sound of distant footsteps. But it didn't take long for the noises to become more deliberate, more distinct. I would hear scratching sounds coming from the attic. At first, I brushed it off. It could be rats, I thought, or maybe just the house itself. But night after night, the scratching grew louder. It was persistent, almost rhythmic, like something was pacing back and forth above me, scraping against the walls. One night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The scratching was so loud that it felt like it was right above my bed, like someone was moving around in the attic, shifting furniture or pacing back and forth. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find. I climbed up to the attic with my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and when I opened it, I was greeted by the familiar musty smell of old wood. The attic was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and random bits of forgotten things. The light from my flashlight bounced off dusty surfaces, casting eerie shadows in every corner. The scratching had stopped. I stood in the middle of the attic, scanning the room. Everything seemed still, undisturbed. There was no sign of anything that could have been causing the sound. But then I noticed something strange. There in the corner, near the far wall, was an old wooden chair. It was facing the wall, its back to me, and it looked like it had been placed there long ago, forgotten. It was out of place. It didn't belong with the other clutter. I walked toward it, my flashlight illuminating the dusty chair, and I froze. There was something on the seat, a small folded piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking. I unfolded the paper, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw what was written on it. Leave. He's waiting for you. I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around the attic, feeling like I was being watched. The air was heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, hidden in the shadows. I turned to leave, my pulse racing, but then I saw something that made me freeze in place. In the far corner, behind some old boxes, there was a figure standing, a man. He was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his presence, a suffocating weight in the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. It was as if my legs were frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. I tried to speak, to ask him who he was or what he wanted, but no words came out. The man didn't say anything. He just stood there, his figure blending into the darkness, his face still hidden. The air grew colder, and I felt a deep sense of dread settle in the pit of my stomach. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the figure, unable to move. But after what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to tear my eyes away and run back down the stairs. I slammed the attic door shut behind me and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to act like everything was normal. I convinced myself that I had imagined the figure in the attic, that my mind had just played tricks on me. But the feeling lingered. It never left. I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was still in that house with me. The scratching in the attic continued, every night without fail, but I couldn't bring myself to go back up there. I couldn't face the man or the presence that seemed to be watching me from the shadows. A week later, I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. I couldn't stay in a house where I felt like I was being haunted, where I felt the weight of something waiting for me at the end of the hall. I packed my things and left, moving into a different apartment. But no matter where I go, I still feel that cold, oppressive feeling that I felt in that attic. Sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my new place, I swear I can hear the faint scratching, distant but familiar. And I know deep down that whatever was in that house is still there, waiting. Story 22, The Whispering Walls. It was my dream apartment, or so I thought. I'd been searching for months trying to find the perfect place to settle into. A quiet neighborhood, a cozy apartment, a fresh start. When I finally found it, I thought my search was over. It was everything I wanted. The apartment was on the top floor of an old building in a small neighborhood, far enough from the city center to be peaceful, yet close enough to everything I needed. The building itself was old, built in the early 1900s with narrow hallways, high ceilings, and thick stone walls. It had a charm to it, an elegance that came from years of history. The landlord was an elderly woman who seemed sweet, if a bit eccentric. She showed me the apartment herself, and when I stepped inside, I felt immediately at home. The first night in the apartment was perfect. The moonlight streamed through the large windows, casting a soft glow over the room. The apartment was quiet, too quiet at first. I liked it. The silence felt peaceful, soothing. But then, as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a nagging feeling, like something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a constant pressure in the air, like the apartment was holding its breath, waiting for something. That night I lay in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard it, a soft whisper. At first I thought it was just the wind, the building settling, or maybe some noise from a neighbor's apartment. But as the whispering continued, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the walls. The whispers were faint, so faint that I could barely make out the words, but there was a distinct rhythm to them. They were almost like a chant, repeated over and over again. It was like someone was talking just behind the walls, too quiet for me to hear clearly, but loud enough to feel the words vibrating through the room. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I listened carefully, straining to hear. The words were soft, incomprehensible, but they felt like they were calling me. I couldn't explain it, but the whispers seemed to grow louder as the night went on, like something was trying to get my attention, like it was trying to communicate with me. I thought about leaving. The thought of packing my things and finding another place crossed my mind, but the apartment was so perfect, so peaceful in every other way. I decided to stay, telling myself it was just my imagination. I told myself I was being dramatic, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder with each passing night. It started with a gentle rustling behind the walls, soft murmurs that I could almost ignore. But soon they became clearer, more distinct. I would hear them no matter where I was. In the apartment, always from the walls, always in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers started to feel less like a noise and more like a presence. They seemed to follow me wherever I went, seeping into the corners of the apartment, filling the air with an uncomfortable weight. I couldn't escape them. I tried everything. I tried putting on music, turning on the TV, and even closing the windows to block out any sounds from outside. But nothing worked. The whispers were there, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the ceiling, and they were getting louder. One night, unable to take it any longer, I decided to investigate. I needed to know where the sounds were coming from. I grabbed a flashlight and started to check every corner of the apartment, listening carefully for any clues. I moved from room to room, tapping on the walls, looking for any sign of where the sound could be originating. As I reached the far corner of the living room, I noticed something odd. There, near the base of the wallpaper was peeling slightly. It was subtle, but the edges of the paper were frayed, like something had been pushing against it. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart pounding. The whispers were louder here, much clearer, like they were right on the other side of the wall. I could almost make out a few words now. Though they were still unintelligible, they felt strangely familiar. The words seemed to have a rhythmic quality to them, almost like a song. Without thinking, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and carefully cut around the peeling wallpaper. My hands shook as I removed a section of the wall covering, revealing a small crack in the plaster. I shone the flashlight into the gap, expecting to find nothing, perhaps an old pipe or some long-forgotten wiring. But instead I saw something that made my blood run cold. Eyes. Two small, glowing eyes stared back at me from the crack in the wall, as though they were watching me, waiting. They were not human eyes. They were dark, hollow, and unblinking. For a moment I was frozen, unable to tear my gaze away. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from behind the crack. Without thinking, I stepped back and ran to the door. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I turned to flee, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. I was alone. But I wasn't alone. The whispers became louder, more urgent, and then just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The apartment went completely silent. I stood there in the dark, staring at the wall, my heart racing. I had to leave. The next morning, I packed up my things and left, abandoning everything behind. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't live in that apartment with those eyes watching me from the walls. The whispers still echo in my mind, and I don't think I'll ever truly be rid of them. They're still there, in the walls of that apartment, waiting for someone else to move in, and I hope no one does. Story 23, The Mirror in the Basement. It was the perfect house. At least that's what I thought when I first saw it. A beautiful old Victorian house with all the charm you could ask for. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and huge windows that let in so much light. The kind of house you could spend hours getting lost in, just exploring all the rooms and corners. It was the kind of place you could picture yourself living in forever. I had been looking for a place for months, and when I found this one, it felt like fate. The landlord was a quiet, older man who didn't seem to have much to say. He gave me the keys without any fuss, and I moved in almost immediately. Everything was perfect at first. The first few nights in the house were calm, and I started to settle in. The house was large enough to get lost in, which I loved. The garden was overgrown but beautiful, and the neighborhood was quiet. It felt like I had all the space I could ever need. But then I found the basement. It wasn't listed on the original floor plan, but there it was, hidden behind a door in the hallway, just beyond the kitchen. It was an old wooden door, thick with dust, the kind of door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I wasn't particularly interested in the basement at first, but something about it piqued my curiosity. Maybe it was the age of the house, or maybe it was the sense of mystery. Either way, I decided to take a look. The basement was like something out of an old movie. The air was cold, the stairs creaked under my weight, and the smell of must and mildew hit me as soon as I stepped down. The floor was made of old stone, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty, forgotten things. Old books, broken furniture, and boxes of who knows what. But it was the mirror that caught my attention. It was large, framed in dark wood, and covered in dust. It was propped up against the wall in the far corner of the basement, standing by itself. The frame was intricately carved, with designs of leaves and vines, but the mirror itself was cracked, the glass distorted in several places. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I don't know why, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. There was something about it that seemed off. The way the cracks ran through the glass made the reflection seem warped, like it was distorting whatever was in front of it. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a mirror or an old piece of furniture that didn't matter. But as I walked past it, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The mirror felt alive, like it was watching me. I felt drawn to it, almost against my will. I stood in front of it, staring at the reflection of the basement, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. That's when I saw it. In the reflection, I saw someone standing behind me. I spun around, but the basement was empty. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. It was just my imagination. I turned back to the mirror, my heart still pounding in my chest. But when I looked, the figure was still there, standing just behind me, a dark silhouette, barely visible but unmistakable. I blinked hard, thinking it was a trick of the light. But when I looked again, the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, watching me. I could feel my heart race as I backed away, unable to tear my eyes away from the reflection. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind me, and tried to shake off the unease that settled in my chest. I didn't go back into the basement for a week, but the feeling lingered, like something was waiting down there, watching me from the shadows. That night I tried to sleep, but the images from the mirror haunted my dreams. I saw the figure again, standing in the reflection, just behind me, always silent, always still. It wasn't until the next week that I decided to face it. I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. I had to know what it was, what it meant. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. So one evening, I went back down to the basement, flashlight in hand, determined to get to the bottom of it. I walked down the stairs slowly, my pulse racing. The basement was even colder than before, the shadows stretching long in the dim light. I walked over to the mirror, my hands shaking, and wiped away some of the dust from the glass. I stared at my reflection, taking a deep breath. I expected to see my own face, pale and a little tired, but what I saw was something else entirely. The figure in the mirror wasn't just standing behind me, it was moving. Its shape started to shift, its form becoming clearer, more defined, like it was coming to life. It was tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness. I could see no features, just a black, hollow shape. And then slowly, it started to smile, a wide, grotesque smile. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. The figure in the mirror grinned, its teeth sharp and uneven, like it was enjoying my fear. It raised a hand, and I could feel my body freeze. I couldn't move, couldn't look away as the figure slowly reached out towards the glass, its hand pressing against the surface, just inches away from my face. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. I turned and ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back upstairs, panting and shaking. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing. I was never going back down there. I moved out of the house the very next day. To this day, I can't get that mirror out of my mind. I've never been able to explain what I saw or what it meant, but I know that whatever it wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal, a gateway to something I'll never understand. And I know deep down that the figure I saw in that reflection is still out there, waiting for someone else to find the mirror, and when they do, it will be ready to claim them. Story 24. The Man in the Window. I'd lived in the apartment for almost a year before I noticed the window. It was a simple one-bedroom unit in an older building on the outskirts of the city. The apartment was small but cozy, and I didn't mind the slightly outdated furniture or the fact that the walls were a bit thin. I worked from home, so the location was perfect. Quiet, private, and just far enough from the city to feel like I had my own little corner of peace. But there was something about the apartment that always made me feel a little uncomfortable. It wasn't the creaking floors or the way the pipes sometimes made strange noises. It wasn't even the flickering light in the hallway. It was something else. It was the window. The apartment had large windows, and one of them was directly across from my desk. It was the kind of window you could look out of and see the street below, the trees swaying gently in the wind, and the occasional pedestrian walking by. On most days, it was nice. a little view of the world outside while I worked. But there was one window just a few units down from mine that always seemed to be staring back at me. It was on the second floor and the curtains were always drawn. But there was something about the way the window faced mine, the angle, the way the light hit it, that made me feel like I was being watched. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was the angle, or maybe I was just imagining things. But the feeling never went away. One evening, I was sitting at my desk, working late as usual, when I happened to glance up at the window. For a moment I thought I saw something, a figure standing behind the curtains. It was just a shadow at first, but as I looked closer, I could swear I saw a face, a pale, blurry face staring out from behind the glass. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, it was gone. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I had been staring at the window for too long. I had been working hard and I was exhausted. I didn't give it another thought, but over the next few days I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had been real. I would glance up at that window every time I worked, always hoping I was just imagining things. But the feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't until a week later that I saw it again. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head toward the window, and there it was. The figure. This time it was clearer, more defined. A man standing in the window across the street, his face obscured by the drawn curtains, but his body clearly visible. He was staring straight at me. I froze. I stared back at the window, heart racing. The man didn't move. He just stood there, perfectly still. I could feel the air in the room grow, thick, heavy with the unshakable feeling of being watched. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Then just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. The window went dark again. I rushed to the door, threw it open, and stepped outside into the hall. I went to the stairwell and climbed up to the second floor, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to know if someone had been there, if it was just my imagination. When I reached the second floor, I knocked on the door of the unit closest to the window. I waited for a moment before an elderly woman opened the door. She looked at me, confused, as I asked if anyone had been in her apartment. She blinked at me. "No one's been in there," she said softly. "It's been empty for months." My blood ran cold. Empty? I quickly made my way back down to my apartment, not saying another word. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The man I'd seen in the window, the one who had been watching me, standing so still, his face hidden. Behind the curtains, couldn't have been in the apartment if it was empty. But I had seen him. I had watched him for minutes, staring at me through the glass. I didn't sleep that night. The following days were a blur of restless nights and long days spent trying to avoid looking at that window. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't escape it, no matter what I did. I even began closing the blinds during the day, hoping that would help ease the tension. But it didn't. Then, one night, things escalated. I was sitting at my desk, working late again, when I looked up and saw the figure standing in the window again. This time, he wasn't just standing there. He was moving. The figure, still obscured by the curtains, began to pace back and forth. It wasn't just a shadow this time. I could see the outline of his movements through the fabric. The figure was walking across the window, going back and forth, like he was trapped in some strange loop. And then, in the blink of an eye, he stopped. He was staring at me. This time the figure wasn't just looking through the window. He was looking into my apartment, directly at me. I froze in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. My eyes were locked on his figure, even though I couldn't see his face. The intensity of his gaze made my skin crawl. It felt like he was waiting for something, for me to make a move, for me to come closer. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment without looking back. I moved out the next day. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw in that window. The apartment is still empty, and I've never seen anyone in the unit across from mine again. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that intense gaze. Those eyes watching me from the shadows. And I know, somewhere out there, in that empty apartment, the man in the window is still waiting. Story 25, The Doll Maker's Curse. I've always been fascinated by antiques. There's something about them. The history, the stories they carry, the lives they've touched. That calls to me. It was no surprise that I found myself working at an antique shop in my late 20s. The shop was small, tucked away on a quiet street, hidden behind rows of newer, more modern businesses. It was the kind of place you had to seek out, like a hidden gem in a world of fast-paced consumerism. The owner of the shop was an elderly man named Mr. Calloway. He was a quiet, kind man with a passion for history and a deep knowledge of all things old. The shop was his life, and he spent his days collecting rare and unusual items from all over the world. But there was one item in the shop that he kept hidden away, tucked in the far corner of the back room. It was a doll. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd seen the doll a few times when I first started working there. It was a delicate porcelain doll, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with glass eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you went. But there was something unsettling about it, something that made me feel uneasy every time I looked at it. The doll was perched on a small wooden chair, placed just so in the corner of the room. It was perfectly positioned, almost like it was waiting for someone to notice it. I had asked Mr. Calloway about it once, but he just shook his head and muttered something about it being a family heirloom, something he didn't want to part with. One evening, after the shop had closed for the night, I found myself alone in the back room. The lights had flickered, as they often did, and I was tidying up, stacking some books on a shelf. My eyes kept drifting toward the corner, where the doll sat, almost as if it was beckoning me. I knew I shouldn't, but something about it called to me. I walked over to the corner and knelt down to get a closer look. The doll was beautiful, its porcelain skin flawless, its eyes glinting in the dim light. I reached out, almost without thinking, to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the doll's smooth face, I felt a cold shiver run through my body. I quickly pulled my hand back, feeling a strange sense of dread wash over me. The doll's eyes seemed to glimmer, and I could have sworn that for a split second, its lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I backed away, my heart racing. What was wrong with me? I tried to shake off the feeling, but something lingered in the air. As I turned to leave the room, I heard a faint whisper, as if someone had called my name. From behind me, I spun around, but the room was empty. The doll sat in its chair motionless. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises from the back room, whispers, creaks, like someone was moving around in there. I told myself it was just the house settling, that I was imagining things. But as the hours passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was in the room with me. The next day I tried to avoid the back room, but it was impossible. The doll was still there, sitting in its chair, its eyes following me wherever I went. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences started happening more frequently. I would hear the whispering at night, soft voices calling my name, and the sound of footsteps following me through the store. Every time I turned a corner, the doll seemed to be watching me even more intently. I asked Mr. Calloway about it again, but this time he grew visibly uncomfortable. He looked away, his hands trembling as he explained that the doll had been created by a doll maker who had lived many years ago. The doll maker was famous for his craftsmanship, but also for the curse he placed on his dolls. According to the story, the doll maker had lost his own daughter to illness, and he became obsessed with creating dolls that could replace her. He poured all his grief and sorrow into his work, and it was said that those who came into contact with his dolls would be haunted by the outer spirit of his lost daughter. I was skeptical, of course. I thought it was just a creepy old story, the kind people tell to make their antique items seem more interesting. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was wrong. The doll seemed to be alive, or at least aware of my presence. That night, I decided to leave early. I didn't want to spend another minute in the shop, especially with that doll staring at me. But as I was locking up, I heard it again. A whisper, so clear this time it made my blood run cold. "You're not leaving." I turned around, but the back room was empty. The doll was still there, sitting in its chair, its glass eyes gleaming in the dim light. But now I could see something I hadn't noticed before. Something in the reflection of the doll's eyes. A shadow. It was standing behind me, just out of sight, but I could see it in the doll's eyes. It was a tall figure, dark and shapeless, but I could feel its presence, like it was reaching out. To me, I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. I had to get out of there. I ran out of the shop, slamming the door behind me, and didn't stop until I was home. I couldn't shake the image of the doll from my mind, the way its eyes seemed to follow me, the shadow lurking just behind me. The next day I returned to the shop, but when I opened the door, I was greeted by an empty, silent room. The back room was no longer there. The doll was gone. The shelves were empty, and the air was thick with dust, as though the shop hadn't been open for years. I asked Mr. Calloway about it, but he had no idea what I was talking about. He insisted the shop had always been there, just as I had remembered it. But I knew what I had seen. I had touched the doll. I had heard the whispers. The shop was abandoned. I never went back to the shop again. But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. The voice of the dollmaker's daughter, and I know deep down that the doll is still out there, waiting for me to return. Story 26. The Shadows in the Library. I've always loved books. Ever since I was a child, I found comfort in the written word. Whether it was fiction or nonfiction, fantasy or history, books were my escape. So when I got the opportunity to work at a local library, I couldn't pass it up. The library was old, with towering shelves of books that stretched up toward the ceiling. The air thick with the smell of paper and ink. It felt like a place where time stood still, where every book held a secret waiting to be uncovered. The library wasn't busy, at least not during the hours I worked. Most days it was just me and a few scattered patrons who came in for research or to find a good novel. It was peaceful, and I quickly became comfortable with my routine. I checked books in and out, organized the shelves, and helped visitors find what they needed. But there was one section of the library that always unsettled me. It was a small, dimly lit room tucked at the back of the library, hidden away from the rest of the space. The room was lined with ancient books and old, worn-out furniture. Most people didn't venture in there. It was mostly for reference materials, old archives that hadn't been touched in years. The light was always faint, and the atmosphere in the room was thick with dust. I was usually the only one who worked there, organizing the old records or pulling out books that hadn't been checked out in decades. I didn't mind the room at first. It had an eerie charm to it, but it was quiet, which was what I liked. But over time, I started to notice strange things happening. It started with the shadows. I'd be in the room sitting at the small desk when I'd see a figure out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my imagination getting the better of me. But the shadows kept moving. They'd dart across the shelves or flicker just outside the corner of the room. No matter how much I tried to focus, they would disappear before I could look directly at them. One afternoon, while I was organizing a stack of old journals, I heard a faint whisper. I froze, looking around the room. There was no one else in the library. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "You shouldn't be here." I stood up quickly, heart racing, but the room was empty. The whisper faded, leaving nothing but the soft rustling of pages from the books around me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I was tired, overworked, and probably just hearing things. But the next day, the shadows were back. This time, they were more distinct. I was shelving a few old volumes when I saw one of the shadows move across the far corner of the room. It was a tall figure, its outline dark and vague, but it was definitely there. The figure seemed to pause for a moment, watching me from the shadows before it disappeared behind a shelf. I couldn't explain it. I had worked in the library for weeks without issue, and now this? The atmosphere in that room had shifted, and it felt wrong, as if the very walls of the library were pressing in on me. The next evening, I decided to confront whatever it was. Armed with only a flashlight, I walked into the room and sat down at the desk, trying to focus on my work. The shadows started to move again, darting between the shelves, creeping closer to me. I could feel them, watching me, waiting. Then I heard it, a soft knock, like someone was tapping gently on the wood of the desk. I turned quickly, but no one was there. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my eyes scanning the room. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling or some old piece of furniture creaking, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The knock came again, and this time, I felt the air grow colder. The temperature in the room dropped, making my breath visible in the dim light. I backed toward the door, my hand gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers started again, low and unintelligible, coming from all around me, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "Leave!" I didn't wait to hear more. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I thought about calling the police, about telling someone what I'd heard, but I didn't want to seem crazy. I was alone in the library and I had to be responsible. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was in that room with me, and it didn't want me there. The next morning, I went back to the library. I couldn't stay away, despite everything that had happened. I had to make sure everything was okay, and I couldn't let my fear control me. But when I walked into the room, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The shelves were different. Some of the books had been pulled out and scattered across the floor, like someone had been rifling through them. There was an old, worn notebook on the desk, one that hadn't been there the day before. I opened the notebook, my fingers trembling. It was filled with handwritten notes in a language I didn't recognize, a language that seemed to twist and turn on the page, as though it was written by someone or something that wasn't human. The entries were dated, stretching back for years, each one becoming more frantic, more desperate. "The shadows are closing in. I can't escape. They won't let me leave." The last entry was the most chilling. "They want me to stay. I can't leave." I slammed the notebook shut, my breath coming in short gasps. I turned to leave, but just as I reached for the door, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone, but the sensation of someone standing behind me, their cold breath on my neck, was unmistakable. I never went back to that library. The building is still there, standing empty and forgotten, but I can't forget the feeling of those eyes watching me from the shadows. Sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, calling me back. And I know deep down that the shadows in that library are still waiting for someone else to come in, someone who might never leave. Story 27, The Lantern in the Woods. I had always been skeptical about ghost stories. I grew up in a small town where locals loved to tell tales about haunted houses, cursed land, and strange occurrences in the nearby woods. But I never took any of it seriously. After all, it was just small-town folklore, right? That all changed when I moved into a cabin on the outskirts of town, near the very woods that had become the subject of so many ghost stories. It wasn't my first choice, but it was a great deal. The cabin was quaint, nestled between towering trees, with nothing but the sound of rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird filling the air. I loved the isolation and the peacefulness. It felt like a perfect retreat, a place to escape from the noise of the city. But from the very first night, something felt off. I was settling in, unpacking boxes, when I noticed something strange just outside the window. It was a light, a small glowing lantern, flickering in the distance through the trees. It wasn't particularly bright, but it was visible, moving slowly, like someone was walking through the woods carrying it. I thought nothing of it at first. I assumed it was someone else in the woods, maybe a hiker or another cabin owner out for a night walk. But when I glanced back a few moments later, the light was still there, and it seemed to be closer than before, as if it was moving toward me. I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me. The woods at night could make anything look strange, but the light didn't disappear. It was still there, slowly moving closer. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The path to the woods was overgrown, and the ground was soft with moss. The light was still visible, just ahead of me, flickering like it was waiting for me to approach. I walked toward it, each step crunching underfoot, the sound of my breathing mixing with the rustling of leaves. The lantern's glow grew brighter, the shape of it clearer. But as I got closer, the figure carrying it remained a mystery. The light seemed to hover in midair, as though the person holding it wasn't quite there. My pulse quickened, and I stopped in my tracks. There was no one. The light was just floating in the dark, drifting aimlessly in the woods. I stared at it, frozen, my mind racing. I thought about turning back, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me toward it, and then the light stopped moving. It hovered in place, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. I could hear my heart pounding in, my chest, my legs too heavy to move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the light. Suddenly it flickered once, twice, and then the lantern went out. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it, a voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Help me." I spun around, looking desperately into the darkness behind me, but there was no one there, just the empty woods stretching out into the night. I ran back to the cabin, my breath ragged, the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the floor, my mind racing. My heart wouldn't stop pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, or following me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the cabin seemed amplified. The creaking of the wood, the wind howling outside, the soft whispering that seemed to come from the walls. The voice in the woods lingered in my mind, its words echoing through my thoughts. "Help me." The next morning, I tried to brush it all off. I told myself I had been imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe the wind had played with the shadows. But when I went outside to take a look around, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. There near the edge of the woods was a lantern. It was lying on the ground, its glass shattered, the wick long since burned out. It was the same lantern I had seen the night before, but there was no sign of anyone. I immediately thought about leaving right then and there, but I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about the woods, something I couldn't explain, that kept me in that cabin. I decided to stay, thinking it would be safer to face whatever was out there than to run from it. That night I tried to keep busy. I worked on my laptop, trying to distract myself from the eerie feeling that seemed to settle over the cabin. But just as the sun set and the sky darkened, I heard it again. The lantern. It was out, there glowing faintly through the trees, just like before. But this time, it wasn't alone. Two lights were flickering now, both moving closer. They swayed side by side like two lanterns being carried by unseen figures. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran outside, sprinting into the woods, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. The lights were ahead of me now, growing brighter, the whispering growing louder. As I approached, the lights seemed to dim, flickering faster and faster until they vanished altogether, leaving me in total darkness. And then I heard the voice again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. "Help me! Please!" I froze, unable to move. The scream echoed through the trees, filling the air with a sense of desperation, of pain. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure. A man. He was standing just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow, his face twisted in agony. His eyes were wide, filled with terror as he reached out toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at him, paralyzed with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The lights went out, and the woods fell silent again. I ran back to the cabin, locking myself inside, my mind racing. The figure, the scream, the lanterns. It all felt too real, too terrifying to ignore. The next morning, I packed up and left the cabin. I never went back. The woods were too haunted, too filled with shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the lanterns were still out there, waiting for someone else to find them. Sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear that voice, faint in the distance. "Help me!" And I know deep down that the lanterns are still out there, flickering in the woods, waiting for someone else to answer the call. Story 28. The last train. It was supposed to be just a normal night. I was finishing up a long shift at work and decided to catch the last train home. The subway system wasn't the most glamorous, but it was efficient. The station wasn't particularly busy at that hour, but there were still a few commuters waiting for their late-night rides. I'd taken this train countless times, always the last passenger to board, watching the station grow emptier and emptier with each stop. This time, however, something felt off. The platform was quieter than usual. The usual low hum of the station was replaced by an almost unnatural silence. I could hear my own footsteps echo as I made my way down the stairs to the platform. It was a strange feeling, the kind that gnawed at the back of your mind, telling you something wasn't right, but you couldn't put your finger on it. I looked around, trying to ignore the feeling. The train was already approaching the station, its headlights cutting through the darkness. And as it rolled to a stop, I noticed something else. There was no one else on the train. Now that wasn't completely unusual. Sometimes this late at night, the train could be almost empty, but this was different. The carriages were completely still, no movement at all inside. I paused for a moment, looking down the length of the train. No one, just emptiness. A strange chill ran through me, but I shrugged it off and boarded the train anyway. The door closed behind me with a soft whoosh, and the train started to move. I sat down in one of the seats near the window, my reflection staring back at me from the glass. For a moment, I just sat there, staring, out at the passing tunnels, the dim lights flickering by. The train was eerily quiet. No sounds of conversation, no clattering of people shifting in their seats. It was the kind of silence that felt suffocating, almost as if the whole world had disappeared. I glanced at the other seats. Empty. I felt a strange unease settle in the pit of my stomach. The longer I sat there, the more the silence seemed to press down on me. Something felt wrong. My eyes darted to the doors, and I realized they were sealed. I tried to press the button to open them, but it didn't respond. The train continued its journey through the tunnels, deeper and deeper into the night. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and tried to ignore the feeling. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I'd probably been working too much. The exhaustion was starting to mess with my head. But then it happened. A figure appeared in the reflection of the window. I froze. For a second, I thought it was just my imagination, but when I turned to look, no one was there. There was only the empty train car behind me, with the same shadows flickering from the overhead lights. I quickly turned back to the window, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was still there, standing in the reflection just behind me. It was a man, tall, with dark hair, and a coat that looked too old-fashioned for this time. He stood perfectly still, just staring at me. His face was pale, almost lifeless, and his eyes were dark, empty. I didn't know why, but the moment I saw him, I felt my skin crawl. I couldn't bring myself to look at him directly, but I could feel his eyes boring into the back of my head. I stood up quickly, my legs unsteady. The train continued its journey. The hum of the wheels on the tracks, the only sound that filled the space. The man didn't move. He just stood there motionless, in the reflection, waiting for me to notice him. I felt trapped. The door wouldn't open, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the train car grew thicker, heavier, as though the walls were closing in. My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. Without thinking, I turned to face the reflection head-on, bracing myself for whatever I might see. And that's when I saw it. The man in the reflection smiled. It wasn't a smile of reassurance or kindness. It was cold, eerie, and full of malice, as if he were amused by my fear. His teeth were sharp and yellowed, his lips pulled back in an almost exaggerated grin. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint and hollow. It's almost time. I spun around to look directly at the man, but again, there was nothing. No one standing in the car with me. The seats remained empty, and the doors were still sealed shut. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I fought to control my breathing. I backed toward the door, desperate to get out, but the train didn't stop. It continued its journey down the tracks, moving faster now. as though it was carrying me deeper into the tunnels, away from any possibility of escape. The voice came again, louder this time. "It's almost time. You can't escape." I turned and ran to the other side of the train, shaking in fear. I pounded on the door, desperate to get out, but the train continued to speed through the dark tunnels. My mind raced. I didn't know what was happening. What was this place? Why couldn't I leave? Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the train came to a halt. The door opened on its own. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the train, not looking back. I ran through the station and out into the cold night air. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling. But when I stopped and looked back, the train was gone. There was no sign of it, no tracks, nothing. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to collect myself. The station was empty, silent. The lights overhead flickered, and there was no one in sight. I haven't taken that train since. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a hallucination, a dream, or something more sinister. But every now and then, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear that voice in my head. It's almost time. And I wonder if the train is waiting for me,